Chapter 1. Introduction to Principal-Agent Relationships. A foundational overview. Welcome, then, to this exploration of the principal-agent relationship, a concept that hums beneath the surface of so many economic interactions. It's a current, if you will, that shapes the flow of decisions, sometimes predictably, sometimes with surprising eddies and diversions. And just as a river carves its path through the land, the dynamics of this relationship etch themselves onto the landscape of markets, organizations, and even governance itself. At its heart, the principal-agent problem arises whenever one party, the principal, delegates authority or responsibility to another, the agent. Think of it as a transfer of stewardship. The principal, for various reasons, finds it beneficial, or perhaps even necessary, to entrust some task or decision-making power to the agent. This delegation, however, is rarely seamless. It's where the interesting complexities begin to bloom. The seed of the problem lies in information asymmetry. The agent, invariably, possesses more information about their own actions and effort than the principal does. Consider the shareholder of a large corporation and the CEO. The shareholder desires increased profits and a rising stock price. They hire the CEO, expecting them to act in a manner that achieves these goals. However, the shareholder cannot perfectly observe the CEO's daily decisions. The late nights poured into strategic planning versus those spent on less productive endeavors. The CEO possesses inside knowledge, a privileged perspective on the corporation's inner workings, that the shareholder can only access indirectly through carefully constructed reports and lagging indicators. This information gap creates the potential for what we call moral hazard. The agent, armed with their informational advantage, might be tempted to act in their own self-interest, even if that interest diverges from the principal's objectives. The CEO, for instance, might prioritize short-term gains to boost their bonus, even if it jeopardizes the long-term health of the company. Or, they might engage in empire building, acquiring companies not for their strategic value, but to increase their own power and prestige. It's not necessarily a matter of malicious intent, but rather a natural human tendency to respond to incentives, especially when those incentives are misaligned. Incentives, therefore, become a crucial tool in the principal's arsenal. Designing contracts that align the agent's interests with their own is paramount. This is where economic ingenuity comes into play. How can we craft compensation packages, performance metrics, and monitoring systems that encourage the agent to act as if they were truly the principal themselves? This is the quest for optimal contract design, a constant balancing act between motivating effort and mitigating risk. Monitoring, of course, is another crucial piece of the puzzle. The principal needs to keep tabs on the agent's behavior, to the extent that is feasible. This could involve financial audits, performance reviews, or even simply observing the agent's actions and outcomes. The cost of monitoring, however, must be weighed against the potential benefits. Excessive monitoring can be intrusive, demoralizing, and even counterproductive. It can stifle innovation and creativity, and create a culture of distrust. The classical economists would argue that the perfect contract should minimize monitoring costs. Contracts themselves are not static documents. They are living agreements, constantly evolving in response to changing circumstances. The policymaker might implement regulations that seek to curb agency problems in specific sectors, such as financial markets or healthcare. These regulations can impose stricter disclosure requirements, mandate certain corporate governance practices, or even prohibit certain types of behavior altogether. However, regulation, too, comes with its own costs and unintended consequences. It can stifle innovation, create regulatory burdens, and even lead to unintended distortions in the market. Striking the right balance between incentives, monitoring, and regulation is the fundamental challenge of addressing principal-agent problems. It's a complex, nuanced task that requires careful consideration of the specific context, the individuals involved, and the potential consequences of different approaches. It is rarely a matter of implementing a one-size-fits-all solution, but rather of tailoring the approach to the specific circumstances. As we conclude this foundational overview, consider this. How do cultural norms and societal expectations influence the effectiveness of different incentive structures and monitoring mechanisms within the principal-agent framework? This, perhaps, will be a thread we begin to unravel in our next exploration. Chapter 2. The Origins of Agency Theory. Economic and Organizational Roots. Good evening. Last time, we sketched the broad contours of economic thought leading up to the formalization of agency theory. Now we delve into the specific problem that ignited its development, the principal-agent problem. Think of this as the engine room of the theory, the source of its power, and indeed, its complexities. The principal-agent problem arises from a simple, almost ubiquitous situation. One party, the principal, delegates authority or tasks to another party, the agent. This delegation, seemingly benign, opens a space for potential divergence. The principal wants something done, but the agent may have different priorities. Imagine, for a moment, a ship. The owner, the principal, desires a profitable voyage. They hire a captain, the agent, to navigate the ship and manage the crew. Ideally, the captain's ambition perfectly aligns with the owner's, maximizing profits through safe and efficient sailing. However, what if the captain values leisure above all else? Or perhaps they are tempted to engage in side deals, using the ship for personal gain. Suddenly, the waters become less clear. At the heart of the principal-agent problem lies the concept of information asymmetry. The agent typically possesses more information than the principal about the task at hand, the environment, and even their own efforts. The captain, for instance, knows the true condition of the ship, the prevailing weather patterns, and the dedication of the crew far better than the distant owner. This informational advantage allows the agent to potentially act in their own self-interest, even if it conflicts with the principal's objectives. To navigate this inherent conflict, economists have focused on three key mechanisms: incentives, monitoring, and contracts. These can be visualized as three legs of a stool, each essential for maintaining a stable relationship. Incentives aim to align the agent's interests with those of the principal. Think of performance-based pay, stock options, or even the threat of dismissal. Returning to our nautical analogy, the captain might receive a bonus based on the ship's profitability, encouraging them to prioritize efficient sailing and minimize risks. The design of effective incentives, however, is a delicate balancing act. Too little, and the agent lacks motivation. Too much, or poorly designed, and unintended consequences may arise. Perhaps the captain takes excessive risks to maximize short-term profits, endangering the ship and crew. Monitoring involves the principal observing and evaluating the agent's actions. This could involve regular audits, performance reviews, or even direct oversight. In our shipping example, the owner might install tracking devices on the ship, review the captain's logs, or even send inspectors to assess the vessel's condition. Monitoring, however, is often costly and imperfect. It's difficult to observe every action, and even when actions are observed, it can be challenging to interpret their true motivations. A captain's log may appear impeccable, even if the ship is subtly being used for illicit activities. Contracts serve as a formal agreement outlining the rights and responsibilities of both parties. A well-designed contract specifies the tasks to be performed, the compensation to be provided, and the penalties for non-compliance. The shipping contract might stipulate the route to be taken, the type of cargo to be transported, and the consequences of delays or damage. Contracts, however, are inherently incomplete. It's impossible to anticipate every contingency, and even the most detailed contract can be subject to interpretation and dispute. Furthermore, enforcing contracts can be costly and time-consuming. The classical economists viewed these mechanisms, incentives, monitoring, and contracts, as tools for minimizing the agency problem and achieving a more efficient allocation of resources. The policymakers saw agency theory as a framework for understanding and regulating various economic relationships, from corporate governance to public administration. Agency theory, therefore, offers a lens through which to examine a vast array of organizational and economic phenomena. It highlights the inherent tensions in delegation, the importance of information, and the need for carefully designed mechanisms to align interests. It posits that effective management is not merely about issuing commands, but about creating systems that incentivize agents to act in the best interests of the organization. But what happens when these tools prove insufficient? What happens when the pursuit of efficiency clashes with other values, such as fairness, trust, and social responsibility? As we move forward, we'll consider the behavioral and organizational dimensions of the principal-agent problem. We'll consider the limitations of purely rational models and delve into the complexities of human motivation and social dynamics. Good night. Chapter 3. Defining the principle. Objectives, risk aversion, and information asymmetry. Having established the broad landscape of principal-agent relationships, let us now turn our attention to a more granular examination of the principle. The principle, in essence, initiates the relationship and delegates a task to the agent. To truly understand the dynamics at play, we must delve into the principle's objectives, their attitude towards risk, and the informational disparities that define the relationship. The objectives of the principle are, naturally, paramount. These objectives might be purely profit-driven, aiming to maximize returns on investment. Alternatively, they could be more complex, encompassing considerations of social welfare, environmental impact, or long-term sustainability. Understanding these objectives forms the very foundation upon which contracts and incentives are built. A classical economist might frame this as a maximization problem, constrained by resources and the behavior of the agent. The more clearly defined and articulated these objectives are, the more effectively the principle can design mechanisms to align the agent's actions with their own. However, objective clarity is only one piece of the puzzle. Risk aversion plays a crucial role in shaping the principal's decision-making process. A principal who is highly risk-averse will likely prefer contracts that offer a guaranteed, albeit perhaps smaller, return over contracts that offer the potential for greater gains but also carry a higher risk of losses. Conversely, a risk-neutral or risk-seeking principal might be more inclined to embrace contracts that involve performance-based incentives, even if those incentives expose them to greater uncertainty. The level of risk aversion will directly influence the structure of the contract and the degree to which the principal is willing to share risk with the agent. Think of it as a balanced scale, weighing potential rewards against perceived dangers. The principal must calibrate their appetite for uncertainty, a calibration that often depends on their overall wealth and financial stability. Now we arrive at the heart of many principal-agent problems: information asymmetry. This refers to the situation where the agent possesses information that the principal does not. This informational advantage can manifest in various ways. The agent might have superior knowledge of the task at hand, their own abilities, or the prevailing market conditions. The principal, lacking this information, faces the challenge of designing a contract that incentivizes the agent to act in their best interest, even when their actions are not perfectly observable. A policymaker designing regulations to protect consumers faces this challenge constantly, never fully knowing the internal operations of the firms they regulate. This information asymmetry introduces what we call moral hazard and adverse selection. Moral hazard arises after the contract is signed, when the agent has an incentive to shirk their responsibilities or take actions that are not in the principal's best interest, because the principal cannot perfectly monitor their behavior. Imagine, for example, a manager who is supposed to be diligently overseeing a project, but instead spends their time on personal pursuits. The principal is unable to observe this directly, leading to a divergence between the manager's actions and the principal's desired outcome. Adverse selection, on the other hand, occurs before the contract is signed. It arises when the principal is unable to distinguish between different types of agents, some of whom may be more capable or trustworthy than others. The principal is forced to offer a contract that appeals to the average agent, which may be less attractive to high-quality agents and more attractive to low-quality agents, leading to a situation where the principal is stuck with less desirable agents. This is akin to the market for used cars, where buyers struggle to differentiate between good cars and lemons, leading to a downward pressure on prices and the potential for good cars to be driven out of the market. To mitigate the effects of information asymmetry, principals often employ various monitoring mechanisms. These mechanisms can range from simple performance reviews to sophisticated auditing procedures. However, monitoring is often costly and imperfect. The more intensely the principal monitors the agent, the higher the costs, and the greater the potential for the agent to feel distrusted and demotivated. Therefore, principals must carefully weigh the benefits of monitoring against the costs. They must find a balance that allows them to gather sufficient information to ensure the agent is acting in their best interest, without stifling the agent's autonomy or creating unnecessary friction in the relationship. Thus, understanding the principal requires a multifaceted approach, considering their objectives, their risk aversion, and the informational constraints under which they operate. These factors interplay in complex ways, shaping the design of contracts and the overall effectiveness of the principal-agent relationship. But what if the agent, not the principal, holds the reins of power in the system? How would the dynamics shift, and what new challenges would emerge in this reversed landscape? We will turn to that question in our next chapter. Defining the agent, motivations, effort levels, and moral hazard. Good evening. We've previously explored the asymmetry inherent in the principal-agent relationship, focusing on the principal's perspective. Now, let's gently shift our gaze. Tonight, we turn our attention to the agent, the individual tasked with acting on behalf of another, a subtle dance of delegation and responsibility. The heart of the principal-agent problem often lies not in outright malice, but in differing motivations. Imagine a river, its current representing individual self-interest. The principal desires the river's energy to power a mill, a beneficial outcome for both. But the agent, residing along the riverbank, may have other uses for the water. Irrigation, personal consumption, perhaps even diverting the flow to a different course altogether. These differing incentives, while not inherently malevolent, create a natural tension. The agent's effort level becomes a crucial variable in this equation. Consider a sculptor commissioned to create a masterpiece. The principal, the patron of the arts, desires a sculpture reflecting glory and skill. The agent, the sculptor, possesses the talent but also faces competing demands. Fatigue, material costs, perhaps even a desire to pursue a different, more personally fulfilling project. The Unveiling, the captors. The intensity of the sculptor's dedication, the willingness to pour heart and soul into the work, is a direct reflection of their effort level. This effort, however, is often obscured, like the sculptor working late into the night, hidden from the patron's direct observation. This brings us to the concept of moral hazard, a term that often carries a negative connotation, but is, in essence, simply a consequence of imperfect information and altered incentives. It's not necessarily about bad behavior, but rather about the rational response to a change in circumstances. The classical economist, observing this phenomenon, would simply say individuals respond to incentives. If an agent's actions are unobservable, and their compensation is not directly tied to performance, they may be inclined to exert less effort than the principal desires. Think of it as a balancing act. The agent weighs the cost of effort against the perceived reward. When the risk of being caught shirking is low and the penalty minimal, the incentive to exert maximum effort diminishes. Monitoring, therefore, becomes a key strategy for the principal. But monitoring is costly, an investment that must be carefully considered. The policymaker, ever mindful of efficiency, understands that complete surveillance is often impractical and even counterproductive. It can breed distrust, stifle creativity, and ultimately erode the very relationship it seeks to protect. Instead, the principal seeks mechanisms to align the agent's incentives with their own, creating a harmonious flow of purpose. Consider the various forms of contracts designed to mitigate moral hazard. Piece rate compensation, where payment is directly tied to output, offers a strong incentive for productivity. However, it may also incentivize quantity over quality, a potential pitfall. Profit-sharing agreements align the agent's financial well-being with the principal's, fostering a sense of shared ownership and responsibility. But these arrangements can be complex, requiring careful measurement and accounting. Equity stakes, offering the agent a partial ownership of the venture, create a powerful alignment of long-term interests. However, such arrangements demand a high level of trust and a willingness to share control. Ultimately, the design of an effective contract is an art, a delicate balancing act between providing adequate incentives, mitigating moral hazard, and preserving the agent's autonomy. It's a process of continuous refinement, adapting to changing circumstances and evolving needs. The ideal contract fosters a sense of mutual trust and shared purpose, transforming the potentially adversarial principal-agent relationship into a collaborative partnership. It is a negotiation of responsibilities and an agreement about how to balance the river's flow for the betterment of all. But how do we measure trust in an economic model? And what happens when inherent biases, conscious or otherwise, interfere with the incentive alignment process? These are questions for another evening. Chapter 5. Information Asymmetry. The core challenge of agency. Problems. Good evening. Last time, we touched upon the genesis of agency problems, the inherent divergence of interests when one party acts on behalf of another. Tonight, we delve deeper into the wellspring of this conflict, the pervasive presence of information asymmetry. Imagine a perfectly balanced scale. On one side, we have the principal entrusting their resources, their very future, to the agent. On the other side, we have the agent, tasked with acting in the principal's best interest. But what happens when one side of the scale is subtly weighted? When one party possesses knowledge the other lacks? The balance is disrupted. The flow of resources becomes less efficient. This, in essence, is information asymmetry. Information asymmetry, at its core, simply means that the principal and the agent do not possess the same information. This disparity can manifest in several ways. Consider, for instance, hidden information. Before entering into an agreement, the agent might possess private knowledge about their capabilities, their intentions, or the true state of the world that the principal cannot fully ascertain. A job applicant, for example, might present a polished resume, concealing subtle weaknesses or exaggerating past achievements. The employer, the principal in this scenario, lacks complete information about the applicant's true potential, creating an imbalance. Then there is hidden action, or moral hazard, as it is often called. This arises after the agreement has been made. The agent might engage in activities that are difficult or impossible for the principal to observe and control. Think of a salesperson who, instead of diligently pursuing new clients, spends their time on personal errands, knowing their actions are unlikely to be directly monitored. The principal, unable to perfectly track the agent's behavior, is at a disadvantage. The classical economist recognized early on that these information imbalances create significant problems. If the principal cannot accurately assess the agent's actions or motivations, how can they design a contract that effectively aligns their interests? The risk of adverse selection looms large, attracting the wrong type of agent, one who is likely to exploit the information advantage. The temptation of moral hazard is ever present. Once hired, the agent may succumb to behaviors that benefit themselves at the expense of the principal. Consider the implications for corporate governance. Shareholders, the principals, entrust their capital to the managers, the agents, of the corporation. Shareholders often have limited insight into the day-to-day operations of the company. Managers, possessing superior information about the company's prospects and challenges, may be tempted to prioritize their own interests, such as maximizing short-term bonuses, even if it comes at the cost of long-term value creation for the shareholder. This misalignment of incentives can lead to suboptimal decisions and, ultimately, a reduction in shareholder wealth. To mitigate the effects of information asymmetry, various mechanisms have been developed. The policymaker, for instance, might implement regulations requiring greater transparency and disclosure from corporations, aiming to reduce the information gap between managers and shareholders. Incentive-based contracts, linking the agent's compensation to the principal's desired outcomes, can help to align interests. Monitoring systems, such as audits and performance reviews, can provide the principal with more information about the agent's actions. However, these mechanisms are rarely perfect. Monitoring can be costly and intrusive, and even the most carefully crafted incentive scheme can have unintended consequences. Ultimately, the challenge of agency problems is not simply about eliminating information asymmetry entirely, a near impossible feat. It is about designing institutions and contracts that effectively manage the inherent information imbalances, creating an environment where agents are incentivized to act in a manner that is broadly aligned with the principal's interests. As we move forward, we will explore specific contract designs and institutional arrangements that address these challenges. We will consider the role of reputation, trust, and social norms in mitigating agency problems. But for now, let us ponder this. If the heart of the agency problem lies in the unequal distribution of knowledge, what are the ethical implications when that knowledge is deliberately withheld or manipulated? Adverse selection. Hidden information before the agreement. Welcome back. Having gently navigated the waters of moral hazard, the temptations that arise after a deal is struck, we now turn our gaze to a trickier current, adverse selection. This is where the information asymmetry exists before any agreement is even put on the table, coloring the entire landscape of potential transactions. It's about the hidden characteristics, the privately held knowledge that one party possesses while the other remains in the dark. Imagine, if you will, a tranquil pond. You wish to purchase a fish from this pond, not knowing which fish are healthy and which are ailing. The fish, naturally, know their own condition. This disparity, this information asymmetry, is the seed of adverse selection. The seller, the fish, or more accurately, the owner of the fish, has information that the buyer lacks. If the buyer offers a price suitable for an average fish, only the owners of the sick fish will be eager to sell. The owners of the healthy fish, knowing their value exceeds the offered price, will hold back. Thus, the pond, or rather the market, becomes disproportionately populated with less desirable specimens. This principle permeates countless facets of our lives. Consider the insurance market. Those who are most likely to need insurance, those with pre-existing conditions or particularly risky lifestyles, are also the most likely to seek it out. If the insurance company doesn't adequately account for this selection of high-risk individuals, it risks underpricing its policies and ultimately insolvency. The company attempts to combat this through risk assessments, medical examinations, and questionnaires, all efforts to extract, or at least infer, the hidden information. Yet, the asymmetry stubbornly persists. The implications for principal-agent problems are profound. Let us say an employer, the principal, wishes to hire a worker, the agent. The employer cannot perfectly observe the worker's inherent abilities or work ethic before hiring them. The worker, on the other hand, knows their own capabilities. If the employer offers a compensation package suited for an average worker, only those who perceive themselves to be less capable may apply. The more skilled individuals, knowing their worth, will seek opportunities elsewhere, where their talents are appropriately valued. The employer, in this scenario, is left with a pool of applicants that is, on average, less qualified than they had anticipated. How, then, can we mitigate the effects of adverse selection? One common solution lies in screening. Screening involves designing mechanisms that induce the informed party to reveal their hidden information. The insurance company's risk assessments are a prime example. In the labor market, employers might use probationary periods, aptitude tests, or even educational credentials as signals of ability. These tools are imperfect, of course, but they help to refine the employer's understanding of the applicant's true potential. Another strategy involves signaling. Here, the informed party takes actions to credibly communicate their private information. A worker with exceptional skills might invest in a prestigious degree or professional certification. This investment signals to potential employers that the worker possesses abilities exceeding the average. The signal must be costly enough that only those who genuinely possess the desired qualities would find it worthwhile to undertake. A degree from a renowned university isn't cheap. It requires dedication, intelligence, and significant financial resources. It is precisely this cost that makes the signal credible. Yet, another approach is pooling. This involves creating contracts that appeal to a broad range of individuals, effectively averaging out the risk. However, pooling can also exacerbate adverse selection, as it may attract a disproportionate number of high-risk individuals, leading to what economists call a death spiral in insurance markets, where premiums rise as healthy individuals opt out, further increasing the proportion of high-risk individuals. Consider the delicate balance. Incentives must be structured carefully to avoid unintentionally selecting for the least desirable outcomes. The classical economist emphasizes careful design. The policymaker grapples with the practical implementation, and we as observers contemplate the inherent complexities of hidden information. Adverse selection reminds us that markets are not always efficient, and that information, or the lack thereof, can profoundly shape outcomes. As we prepare to move forward, consider this. If adverse selection precedes the agreement and moral hazard follows it, what forces govern the negotiation itself, the moment of creating the agreement under asymmetric information? How do perceptions, bargaining power, and strategic foresight influence the ultimate outcome? We shall explore these questions in our next chapter as we delve deeper into the fascinating world of contract theory. Moral hazard. Hidden actions after the agreement. Welcome back. We've navigated the treacherous waters of adverse selection, where hidden information before an agreement can destabilize the entire endeavor. Now, we turn our attention to its shadowy cousin, moral hazard. This isn't about who appears to be a good risk initially. It's about how behavior changes once the contract is signed. Imagine, if you will, a quiet stream, initially clear, becoming muddied by unseen currents beneath the surface. That murkiness represents the altered actions that define moral hazard. At its core, moral hazard arises when one party, the agent, can take actions that affect the payoff of another party, the principal, and the principal cannot perfectly observe these actions. The incentives are therefore misaligned. The agent, shielded from the full consequences of their choices, may act in a way that maximizes their own benefit, even if it undermines the overall efficiency or the principal's interests. It's a subtle shift of equilibrium, a recalibration of the internal compass once external constraints are loosened. Consider the classic case of insurance. Once insured, individuals may be less careful. The homeowner with fire insurance might become more lax about fire safety, knowing that the financial burden of a potential fire will be borne, at least partially, by the insurance company. The driver with comprehensive car insurance might drive with a touch more recklessness, confident that repairs are covered. This isn't necessarily malicious. It's often a subconscious adjustment to a new set of incentives. The risk has been transferred, and with it, a fraction of the responsibility. The classical economist would have seen this as an inevitable outcome of imperfect information and rational self-interest, a predictable ripple in the pond of economic interaction. Monitoring then becomes crucial. If the principal could perfectly observe the agent's actions, the problem would vanish. But, in reality, perfect monitoring is rarely, if ever, attainable. The insurance company can't station a representative in every home or car. Attempts at monitoring, such as requiring smoke detectors or safe driving courses, are imperfect proxies, indirect attempts to steer behavior back towards a more desirable path. These measures act as dams, attempting to control the flow and mitigate the potential damage caused by unforeseen actions. Contracts, too, can be designed to mitigate moral hazard. Deductibles and co-pays in insurance contracts force the insured to bear a portion of the cost, thereby aligning their incentives more closely with those of the insurer. Performance-based pay in employment contracts ties compensation to measurable outcomes, encouraging employees to work harder and smarter. These contract designs represent a delicate balancing act, attempting to incentivize desired behavior without creating unintended consequences. The policymaker wrestles with these considerations constantly, always searching for the optimal configuration. The challenge, however, is that even the most ingenious contract is rarely foolproof. Unforeseen loopholes can be exploited, unintended side effects can emerge, and the agents, being rational and resourceful, may find new ways to game the system. The system is always in flux, a dynamic interplay of incentives and responses. For example, stringent regulations intended to prevent risky behavior in the financial sector can sometimes drive that behavior underground, making it even harder to detect and control. Moral hazard extends far beyond insurance and employment. It pervades lending, where borrowers may take on riskier projects knowing that the lender will bear a significant portion of the losses if the project fails. It manifests in government bailouts, where financial institutions may engage in excessive risk-taking, confident that they will be rescued if things go wrong. It's a pervasive force, a subtle erosion of responsibility that can undermine the stability of entire systems. Ultimately, understanding moral hazard requires a recognition that incentives matter and that individuals will respond to those incentives in predictable ways. Designing effective institutions and policies requires a careful consideration of how those incentives will be shaped and how individuals will adapt their behavior in response. It's a continuous process of refinement, an ongoing attempt to steer the ship of economic activity towards a more efficient and equitable course. But what happens when the very act of trying to solve moral hazard problems creates new kinds of moral hazard? Where does the cycle end? This question guides our next exploration, one that will lead us into even deeper, more complex economic territory. Chapter 8: Transaction Costs and the Agency Problem. A crucial link tonight, we continue our exploration of the intricate dance between economic actors. Recall our earlier discussion on the pervasive nature of information asymmetry. The world, as we've seen, is rarely transparent. This lack of perfect information creates friction, like tiny grains of sand in the gears of a complex machine. And tonight, we delve into how these grains, specifically transaction costs, exacerbate a particularly thorny issue: the principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem arises whenever one party, the principal, delegates authority or decision-making power to another, the agent. Think of a shareholder entrusting the management of a corporation to a CEO, or a homeowner hiring a contractor. The core challenge lies in the fact that the agent's interests might not perfectly align with those of the principal. The agent, driven by their own motivations, may make decisions that benefit themselves, perhaps at the expense of the principal. This divergence of interests isn't necessarily malicious. It's simply a reflection of human nature and the inherent incentive structures that shape our choices. Now, consider the role of transaction costs. These are the expenses incurred when engaging in an economic exchange, beyond the price of the good or service itself. They include the costs of searching for information, negotiating contracts, monitoring performance, and enforcing agreements. These costs act as a kind of drag on the system, dampening the effectiveness of mechanisms designed to align the principal and agent's interests. Let's illustrate. Imagine a small business owner, our principal, hiring a sales representative, the agent. The principal desires maximum sales, while the agent might prioritize a more leisurely approach, content with meeting minimum quotas. To bridge this gap, the principal could implement a bonus system, an incentive designed to motivate the agent to exert more effort. However, designing and implementing such a system incurs transaction costs. The principal must spend time researching effective bonus structures, tracking the agent's sales performance, and administering the payouts. If these transaction costs become too high, the principal might forgo the bonus system altogether, accepting a lower level of sales than desired. Furthermore, monitoring the agent's performance isn't costless. The principal might need to invest in software, hire a supervisor, or conduct regular audits. These monitoring costs, another facet of transaction costs, aim to reduce the information asymmetry between the principal and agent, ensuring the agent adheres to the agreed-upon term. However, perfect monitoring is often unattainable, and even imperfect monitoring carries a price. This imperfection, this inherent costliness, opens the door for the agent to potentially shirk responsibilities or act opportunistically. Contracts, the formal agreements that bind principals and agents, are also affected by transaction costs. Crafting a comprehensive contract that anticipates every possible contingency can be exceedingly expensive, requiring legal expertise and extensive negotiation. The classical economist believed in a world of perfect contracts, but in reality, contracts are always incomplete, leaving room for ambiguity and potential disputes. Enforcing a contract, should a breach occur, involves legal fees and the expenditure of time and resources, all contributing to transaction costs. Therefore, minimizing the principal-agent problem requires a delicate balance. The policymaker must consider the trade-offs between implementing incentive mechanisms, monitoring agent behavior, and crafting comprehensive contracts, all while being mindful of the associated transaction costs. An overly complex system, burdened by high transaction costs, can be just as detrimental as a system with inadequate controls. In essence, transaction costs act as a lens, refracting the relationship between principals and agents. They color the landscape of incentives, monitoring, and contracts, shaping the dynamics of economic exchange. They are the invisible hand influencing the behavior of both parties. They remind us that efficiency isn't just about producing goods and services. It's also about minimizing the costs of organizing and coordinating economic activity. As we move forward, let us contemplate how these transaction costs, these unavoidable frictions, influence the very structure of markets and organizations. To what extent do they dictate the boundaries of firms and the choices individuals make about entering into agreements? What new innovations might arise to reduce these costs and unlock more efficient economic outcomes? These are the questions that will guide us as we navigate the next phase of our journey. Chapter 9. Contract Theory, Designing Incentive-Compatible Contracts. Welcome, once again, to our quiet contemplation of economic landscapes. We have previously observed market structures and imperfections, and now we turn our attention to a microeconomic challenge of profound consequence: the design of incentive-compatible contracts within the framework of principal-agent problems. Think of it as crafting the very language of collaboration, ensuring that all parties sing from the same, albeit carefully composed, song sheet. Principal-agent problems arise when one party, the principal, delegates a task to another, the agent. The crucial element is an asymmetry of information. The agent often possesses knowledge the principal lacks, regarding effort expended or the true state of the world. This informational imbalance breeds opportunities for what economists euphemistically call opportunistic behavior. Imagine a landlord hiring a property manager. The landlord wants the property well maintained, but the manager might prioritize leisure over diligently addressing every leaky faucet. How can the landlord design a contract that aligns the manager's interests with his own? The core challenge lies in providing the agent with the right incentives to act in the principal's best interest, even when direct monitoring is impossible or prohibitively expensive. This is where contract theory becomes our compass and map. We aim to design contracts that are incentive compatible, meaning they induce the agent to reveal their private information or exert the desired level of effort. Think of it as creating a self-regulating ecosystem where individual optimization leads to collective well-being. Consider, for example, a salesperson working for a company. The company cannot perfectly observe the salesperson's effort. They can only observe the sales generated. A simple salary contract might provide insufficient motivation, as the salesperson receives the same compensation regardless of performance. A commission-based contract, on the other hand, directly links pay to output, incentivizing greater effort. However, a purely commission-based contract can also be problematic. What if external factors, such as a sudden economic downturn, significantly reduce sales despite the salesperson's diligent efforts? The risk borne by the agent becomes excessive. The optimal contract, therefore, often involves a delicate balance. A fixed salary component provides a baseline level of security, while a variable component, such as commissions or bonuses, aligns incentives with the principal's goals. This echoes a fundamental principle of economic design. Risk should be borne by the party best able to manage it. If the agent is highly risk-averse, the principal might bear more of the risk, offering a larger fixed salary and smaller commission. If the agent is less risk-averse, the principal might shift more of the risk onto the agent, offering a smaller salary and a higher commission. It is a finely tuned equation, a dance of risk and reward. Beyond monetary incentives, contracts can also incorporate non-monetary elements, such as performance reviews, promotion opportunities, and the establishment of a strong organizational culture. These elements can foster a sense of intrinsic motivation, encouraging the agent to act in the principal's best interest, not just for financial gain, but also for personal satisfaction and professional growth. Think of it as enriching the soil in which collaboration takes root. Furthermore, contract theory considers the importance of participation constraints. The contract must offer the agent at least as much utility as they could obtain elsewhere. If the contract is too unattractive, the agent will simply refuse to participate. It's a basic matter of economic gravity. Resources flow to where they are most valued. The implications of contract theory extend far beyond simple employment relationships. They are relevant in a wide range of contexts, including insurance markets, corporate governance, and even international trade agreements. Any situation where one party delegates a task to another and faces informational asymmetry presents a principal-agent problem. The art of contract design, then, lies in understanding the specific characteristics of the situation, including the agent's risk aversion, the available information, and the enforceability of the contract. It requires a deep understanding of human behavior and a nuanced appreciation of the interplay between incentives, information, and risk. A process more akin to tending a garden than assembling a machine. And as we conclude our session, consider this. Are perfectly incentive-compatible contracts ever truly attainable? Or are we forever navigating a landscape of imperfect information and bounded rationality? Is the inherent imperfection in human endeavor and the asymmetry of information forever a limit on the grand structures that economic actors erect? Monitoring mechanisms. Reducing information asymmetry. Last time, we delved into the intricacies of incentive design, exploring how to align the interests of principals and agents through carefully crafted compensation structures. Today we turn our attention to another crucial piece of the puzzle: monitoring. If incentives are the carrot, monitoring is, perhaps, the watchful eye ensuring the carrot isn't simply devoured without the expected work being done. The essence of the principal-agent problem, as we've discussed, stems from information asymmetry. The agent typically possesses more knowledge about their own actions, abilities, and the circumstances surrounding their tasks than the principal does. This information gap allows for opportunistic behavior, or what we might call shirking, the agent expending less effort than agreed upon, or even acting against the principal's best interests. To mitigate this, principals employ a variety of monitoring mechanisms designed to reduce this asymmetry and gain a clearer picture of the agent's performance. Think of it as a balancing act. On one side, we have the cost of monitoring. Employing monitoring mechanisms isn't free. It consumes resources, be they financial, human, or technological. Too much monitoring can become intrusive, demotivating the agent and stifling creativity. It can also create a culture of distrust, ultimately undermining the principal-agent relationship. On the other side, we have the potential benefits of monitoring: improved performance, reduced shirking, and greater alignment with the principal's objectives. The optimal level of monitoring, therefore, is where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, a delicate equilibrium point. These mechanisms can take many forms. Consider, for example, direct supervision, a manager directly observing an employee, reviewing their work in real time. This is a high-intensity form of monitoring, often suitable for tasks that are easily observable and where immediate feedback is crucial. However, it can be resource-intensive and may not be appropriate for tasks requiring autonomy and independent judgment. Then there's performance measurement, establishing clear, quantifiable metrics to assess the agent's output. This could involve tracking sales figures, production rates, or customer satisfaction scores. Performance measurement provides a more objective basis for evaluation and can be particularly effective when coupled with incentive-based compensation. However, it's crucial to ensure that the metrics are aligned with the principal's overall goals. Focusing solely on easily measurable aspects can lead to unintended consequences, as agents may neglect other important, but less quantifiable, dimensions of their work. Another important monitoring mechanism is the use of audits and reviews, independent assessments of the agent's activities to ensure compliance with established procedures and standards. This is particularly common in financial contexts, where auditors scrutinize accounting records to detect fraud or errors. Audits can provide valuable insights into the agent's behavior and can help to prevent costly mistakes. However, they can also be perceived as intrusive and may not always capture the full complexity of the agent's actions. Furthermore, market mechanisms can act as powerful monitoring tools. Consider the case of a CEO whose performance is closely scrutinized by shareholders. The stock market price, reflects investors' collective assessment of the CEO's abilities and decisions. A declining stock price signals dissatisfaction and can put pressure on the CEO to improve performance. In this sense, the market acts as a continuous, albeit sometimes volatile, monitor. Contract design also plays a crucial role in facilitating monitoring. Clear, unambiguous contracts that specify the agent's responsibilities and the principal's expectations can reduce ambiguity and provide a basis for evaluating performance. Contracts can also include provisions for regular reporting and information sharing, ensuring that the principal has access to the data needed to assess the agent's actions. The policymaker, for instance, might implement a system of regulatory reporting to monitor the activities of firms in a particular industry. Ultimately, the choice of monitoring mechanism depends on the specific context. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The classical economist would likely emphasize the importance of market-based monitoring, allowing competitive forces to discipline agents. The policymaker, on the other hand, might favor regulatory oversight to ensure compliance with social norms and ethical standards. Effective monitoring is not simply about gathering information. It's about using that information to improve decision-making and strengthen the principal-agent relationship. It's a continuous process of observation, evaluation, and adjustment, aimed at achieving a harmonious balance between autonomy and accountability. But as we refine our monitoring tools and tighten our contracts, we must also consider the unintended consequences. Can an over-reliance on monitoring stifle innovation and risk-taking? How do we ensure that monitoring mechanisms are fair and equitable, and that they don't inadvertently create new forms of information asymmetry? These are questions we'll begin to explore as we move into the next phase of our economic exploration. Chapter 12. Performance-based pay. Linking agent rewards to outcomes. Last time, we explored the foundations of compensation structures. Now, we turn our attention to the fascinating, and often frustrating, world of performance-based pay. This is where the rubber meets the road, where theory confronts the messy reality of human motivation and measurable outcomes. Here, we engage with the core of principal-agent problems, aligning the interests of those who own resources with those who manage them. The heart of the matter lies in incentive structures. Imagine a garden, meticulously planned by a landscape architect, but tended by a gardener. The architect desires a riot of blooming colors, a perfectly manicured lawn. The gardener, however, might prioritize ease of work, perhaps neglecting some weeding or choosing hardier, less demanding plants. This divergence of interests is the essence of the principal-agent problem. To bridge this gap, we often turn to performance-based pay. The idea is elegantly simple. Reward the agent based on the achievement of the principal's desired outcomes. Increased profits, higher sales, improved customer satisfaction. These become the yardsticks by which the agent's compensation is measured. This, in theory, incentivizes the agent to act in a way that directly benefits the principal, effectively aligning their self-interest with the broader organizational goals. But the path to effective performance-based pay is paved with potential pitfalls. One significant challenge is monitoring. How do we accurately and fairly measure the agent's performance? Returning to our garden analogy, is it enough to simply count the number of flowers? What about the overall health of the plants, the soil quality, or the long-term sustainability of the garden? Defining meaningful and measurable performance metrics is crucial, but often exceedingly difficult. Some aspects of performance are easily quantified, while others are inherently subjective and require careful qualitative assessment. Furthermore, the design of the contract itself is paramount. A poorly designed performance-based pay system can create unintended consequences. For example, if sales are the sole metric for reward, the agent might prioritize short-term gains at the expense of long-term customer relationships. Or, if production quotas are emphasized, quality might suffer. The contract must be carefully crafted to incentivize desired behaviors without inadvertently encouraging undesirable ones. The classical economist reminds us that humans respond to incentives, but sometimes in ways we didn't anticipate. Consider the challenges of motivating a CEO, for instance. Stock options, a common form of performance-based pay, are intended to align the CEO's interests with those of the shareholders. The theory is that as the company's stock price rises, both the shareholders and the CEO benefit. However, this can also incentivize short-term, high-risk strategies that boost the stock price in the short run, even if they are ultimately detrimental to the long-term health of the company. The policymaker often grapples with the question of how to regulate and design these incentives to promote responsible corporate governance. The level of risk aversion of the agent also plays a critical role. An agent who is highly risk-averse might be unwilling to accept a compensation structure that is heavily weighted towards performance-based pay, preferring the security of a fixed salary. The agent may feel that the uncertainty and volatility associated with performance-based pay outweigh the potential for higher rewards. This can lead to a situation where the most talented agents, who have more outside options, are unwilling to accept the offered terms, leaving the principal with a less capable or motivated workforce. Ultimately, designing an effective performance-based pay system is a delicate balancing act. It requires a deep understanding of the agent's motivations, the nuances of the work being performed, and the potential for unintended consequences. It's about finding the right mix of fixed and variable compensation, carefully chosen metrics, and robust monitoring mechanisms. It's about creating a system that is both fair and effective, that aligns the interests of the principal and the agent, and that ultimately leads to improved organizational performance. As we conclude this chapter, we're left pondering a crucial question. How do ethical considerations further complicate this landscape? Is pure efficiency the only benchmark, or are there moral boundaries to the pursuit of performance? This ethical dimension will become central as we navigate the future of economic systems. Stock options and equity-based compensation. Aligning interests? We've navigated the turbulent waters of corporate governance and seen the importance of shareholder value maximization. But the sea of economic reality is rarely smooth. Today, we turn to a seemingly simple tool designed to harmonize the interests of shareholders and managers: stock options and equity-based compensation. The question is, does it truly work, or does it merely create a different set of currents? The underlying problem, as we've discussed, is the principal-agent problem. The shareholders, who own the company, delegate decision-making authority to the managers. However, the manager's interests may not perfectly align with the shareholders' goal of maximizing long-term firm value. This divergence can lead to what economists gently term agency costs, the costs of monitoring managers and the losses that occur when managers act in their own self-interest, perhaps at the expense of the firm's overall health. Imagine a slightly leaky vessel. These costs are the slow, persistent drips that, over time, can accumulate to significant losses. One attempted solution, quite popular in recent decades, involves granting managers stock options. A stock option gives the manager the right, but not the obligation, to purchase company stock at a predetermined price within a specified time frame. The rationale is elegant. If the manager increases the company's stock price, the option becomes valuable. The manager profits alongside the shareholders, theoretically aligning their incentives. The goal is to make the manager feel, in a sense, more like an owner. However, the reality is more nuanced. The incentive created by stock options is not always the pure and harmonious resonance we might hope for. Let us consider the potential dissonance. A manager with stock options nearing their expiration date may be tempted to focus on short-term gains, even if those gains come at the expense of long-term value. Imagine them furiously rowing to reach a nearby island, even if it means damaging the hull and ultimately sinking the ship further down the line. This can manifest as excessive risk-taking, aggressive accounting practices, or neglecting investments in research and development that might pay off in the long run, but don't offer immediate gratification. Furthermore, the value of stock options depends not just on the company's performance, but also on broader market trends. A rising tide, as the saying goes, lifts all boats. Even a mediocre manager might see their options become valuable simply because the overall stock market is doing well. Conversely, a skilled manager might see their options remain underwater due to factors beyond their control, such as an unexpected economic downturn. This creates an element of luck, blurring the direct link between managerial effort and reward. The classical economist might argue that such situations introduce distortions, disrupting the efficient allocation of resources. Equity-based compensation, a broader category than just stock options, can also include restricted stock grants or performance shares. These instruments are designed to address some of the shortcomings of stock options. Restricted stock, for example, vests over time, encouraging a longer-term perspective. Performance shares are tied to specific, measurable goals, theoretically aligning managerial incentives with the company's strategic objectives. Yet, even these, more sophisticated forms of equity-based compensation are not without their challenges. Defining and measuring performance accurately can be difficult. Gaming the system becomes a possibility. A skillful manager might manipulate metrics to achieve the desired targets, even if those achievements don't truly reflect improved firm performance. The policymaker, in their wisdom, must design contracts that anticipate and mitigate these potential pitfalls. Monitoring managerial behavior remains crucial, even with equity-based compensation in place. Robust corporate governance mechanisms, such as independent boards of directors and strong audit committees, are essential to ensure that managers are acting in the best interests of the shareholders. Transparency and accountability are the watchwords here. We must ensure that the light of scrutiny shines brightly on the actions of those entrusted with managing the firm. Ultimately, the effectiveness of stock options and equity-based compensation in aligning the interests of principals and agents depends on a complex interplay of factors. It is a delicate balancing act, requiring careful design, diligent monitoring, and a healthy dose of skepticism. The instruments themselves are not magic bullets. They are tools that, like any tool, can be used effectively or misused to destructive ends. And with this in mind, what new types of managerial incentive tools will arise within the coming digital age? Chapter 14. Efficiency wages. Incentivizing effort through higher pay. Ah, yes. We were discussing, weren't we, the delicate dance of labor supply and demand, the point at which equilibrium supposedly reigns. But the real world, as it so often does, presents complications. We now turn to a fascinating deviation from the straightforward equilibrium, a concept known as efficiency wages, a concept rooted in the very human problem of trust, or rather, the lack thereof, a concept intricately linked to principal-agent problems. Let's settle in, shall we, and see what we can uncover. At its core, the principal-agent problem stems from an asymmetry of information. Imagine the owner of a company, our principal, hiring a worker, the agent. The owner needs the worker to exert effort, to be productive, but the owner cannot perfectly observe the worker's level of effort. Perhaps the worker is diligent, focused, maximizing output. Perhaps not. The owner only sees the results of that effort, not the effort itself. This inherent uncertainty is the seed of the problem. Traditional economic models assume that wages are set at the market clearing level, the point where the supply and demand for labor intersect. The classical economist might argue that paying above this level is inefficient, a distortion. Why pay more when you can hire someone else at the going rate? Because, my friends, it's not always about the going rate. It's about the getting rate, getting the worker to give their best. And that, often, requires an incentive beyond the bare minimum. Consider the implications. If the worker is paid only the market clearing wage, and they know their effort is not perfectly monitored, what incentive do they have to work hard? A low wage, combined with imperfect monitoring, creates a fertile ground for shirking, for exerting less effort than agreed upon. This shirking, in turn, reduces overall productivity, negating any apparent cost savings from the lower wage. Efficiency wages offer a counterintuitive solution. Pay the worker more than the market clearing wage. Why? Several reasons. First, a higher wage makes the worker more valuable to the company. The cost of losing the job, the rent associated with the position, increases. The worker is now less likely to risk being fired for shirking, as finding another job at the same elevated wage may be difficult. Second, a higher wage can boost morale. A worker who feels valued and fairly compensated is more likely to be motivated and productive. Think of it as cultivating a garden. A plant nourished with the right elements thrives far better than one left to struggle in poor soil. Similarly, a worker who feels valued thrives in their role. Third, efficiency wages can attract a higher quality pool of applicants. When the owner advertises a job with a higher than average wage, they are more likely to attract individuals who are skilled, experienced, and dedicated. The policymaker might see this as a beneficial outcome. The effectiveness of efficiency wages depends on a delicate balance. Too high, and the firm's profits suffer. Too low, and the incentive effect vanishes. Finding the optimal efficiency wage requires careful consideration of factors such as the ease of monitoring, the cost of job loss for the worker, and the overall labor market conditions. However, efficiency wages are not a panacea. They can contribute to unemployment, as firms choose to hire fewer workers at higher wages, rather than more workers at lower wages. The economic landscape is rarely simple, is it? We've explored how paying more can sometimes lead to greater efficiency, a seeming paradox rooted in the fundamental challenges of trust and information. But what happens when trust erodes entirely? What happens when moral hazard, the temptation to act dishonestly when unobserved, becomes the dominant force? How do economic systems cope with systemic corruption? That, my friends, is a question for another night, another chapter. Drift off to sleep now, and let these ideas settle gently in your mind. Good night. Wow. Chapter 15. Tournaments and Relative Performance Evaluation. Competition as a Tool. Good evening. In our exploration of principal-agent problems, we've considered contracts designed to align the interests of those who delegate with those who act on their behalf. Tonight, we shift our focus to a subtly different, yet profoundly impactful, method of incentive alignment: tournaments and the broader concept of relative performance evaluation. Imagine a system, not unlike a flowing river, where individual contributions are difficult to isolate. When outcomes are influenced by unpredictable currents, by the ebb and flow of external forces, it becomes challenging to directly tie compensation to individual merit. In such environments, measuring absolute performance can be noisy, obscuring true skill with the randomness of circumstance. This is where the elegance of tournaments shines. Rather than focusing on the absolute output of each agent, we evaluate their relative standing within a pool of their peers. Think of a golf tournament. The winner doesn't necessarily need to achieve a record-breaking score. They simply need to perform better than the other participants. The focus shifts from battling the elements alone to battling the other players, regardless of the weather. Consider the implications for incentive design. If all agents face similar external shocks, a sudden market downturn, a technological disruption, or a collective challenge, the comparative ranking remains largely unaffected. The tournament structure filters out the common noise, allowing the signal of relative skill to emerge more clearly. This is particularly useful when monitoring individual contributions is costly or impossible. The principal, like a wise gardener tending a field, doesn't need to track every seed's individual growth. They only need to see which plants thrive best relative to their neighbors. The beauty of this system lies in its ability to foster competition. The promise of a larger reward for superior relative performance motivates agents to exert greater effort. The policymaker, seeking to boost productivity, might institute internal ranking systems within a government department, offering promotions based on peer evaluation. The classical economist, observing this system, would note the inherent cost-effectiveness. Only the winner receives the significant prize, yet all participants are incentivized to strive for excellence. However, like any carefully balanced ecosystem, tournaments have their potential pitfalls. If the stakes are too high, agents might be tempted to sabotage their competitors rather than focusing on improving their own performance. Cooperation, a vital component of many successful endeavors, can be undermined by an overly aggressive competitive environment. Imagine a team of researchers, each vying for individual recognition, ultimately hindering the collective scientific progress. Furthermore, the design of the tournament itself is crucial. If the pool of competitors is not sufficiently homogeneous, if some agents possess inherent advantages due to experience, resources, or sheer luck, the system can be perceived as unfair, leading to demotivation and resentment. The policymaker must ensure a level playing field, mitigating disparities and providing opportunities for all participants to demonstrate their abilities. The classical economist, ever mindful of efficiency, would highlight the importance of carefully calibrated prizes, ensuring that the rewards are commensurate with the effort required and the potential benefits gained. Moreover, remember that tournaments only reward relative, not necessarily absolute, performance. A group of underperforming agents can still have a winner, even if their collective output is suboptimal. The principal must therefore establish a baseline level of acceptable performance, ensuring that the entire pool of agents meets certain minimum standards. This often involves a blend of tournament-style incentives with other forms of monitoring and evaluation. The use of tournaments represents a sophisticated evolution in our understanding of principal-agent dynamics. It is a nuanced tool capable of harnessing the power of competition to drive productivity, while simultaneously requiring careful consideration of its potential unintended consequences. As we conclude this chapter, we can consider whether the very act of creating this relative environment could be a net positive compared to not trying to create alignment at all. Perhaps an honest but failed alignment attempt might be a better platform to build from than a purely disconnected relationship between principal and agent. As we prepare to move onward, consider this. How do these incentive structures, both direct contracts and relative performance evaluations, interact with the broader social and ethical landscape? Do they foster collaboration or competition? Do they promote fairness or exacerbate inequality? These questions, like gentle ripples in a pond, lead us towards our next exploration: the role of social norms and reputational concerns in shaping economic behavior. Good night. Complete versus incomplete contracts. Dealing with unforeseen circumstances, we've explored how incentives, carefully crafted, can align the interests of the principal and their agent. But the world, as we know, rarely allows for perfect blueprints. Now, let us turn our attention to the inherent limitations of contracts and how unforeseen circumstances can disrupt even the most meticulously designed agreements. We'll delve into the distinction between complete and incomplete contracts and explore how these imperfections influence economic outcomes. Imagine a contract, a vessel designed to navigate the seas of economic interaction. A complete contract, in theory, is a vessel capable of weathering any storm. It specifies in exhaustive detail the obligations of each party under every conceivable contingency. The price, the quantity, the quality, all are predetermined, leaving no room for ambiguity, no space for opportunistic behavior. Should a hurricane arise, say, a sudden surge in raw material costs, the contract explicitly dictates how the burden is to be shared. However, in practice, true complete contracts are often elusive, like mirages in the desert. The sheer complexity of human affairs, the inherent uncertainty of the future, renders it nearly impossible to anticipate and codify every possible outcome. Think of a long-term construction project. Can one truly foresee every geological anomaly, every supply chain disruption, every shift in regulatory policy that might impact the project's cost and timeline? The answer, more often than not, is no. Wow. This is where incomplete contracts enter the picture. An incomplete contract acknowledges the limitations of foresight. It recognizes that some contingencies will inevitably arise that were not explicitly addressed in the original agreement. It's like a ship equipped with only a basic map, relying on the crew's skill and judgment to navigate uncharted waters. But with this flexibility comes vulnerability. Consider the classic principal-agent problem in the context of incomplete contracts. The policymaker, representing the public interest, commissions a private firm to build a new highway. The contract specifies the basic design, the materials to be used, and the initial price. However, unforeseen geological challenges arise during construction, requiring costly modifications. The contract is silent on who bears the additional expense. Here, the principal-agent problem intensifies. The private firm, now holding valuable private information about the extent of the challenge and the cost of the necessary modifications, has an incentive to exploit the situation. They might inflate the cost estimates, knowing that the policymaker is locked into the project and has limited options. The policymaker, lacking perfect information and facing political pressure to complete the highway, may be forced to accept the firm's terms, resulting in a less efficient outcome for society. The implications of incomplete contracts are far-reaching. They can lead to hold-up problems, where one party exploits their bargaining power to extract concessions from the other. They can stifle investment, as firms become hesitant to commit resources to projects when the terms of the agreement are uncertain. They can necessitate costly renegotiations, diverting resources from productive activities. Therefore, managing incomplete contracts requires careful consideration. The classical economist might suggest focusing on strengthening legal frameworks and enforcing contractual obligations to the fullest extent possible. While helpful, this approach alone cannot eliminate the inherent uncertainties that give rise to incompleteness. Alternative approaches involve designing contracts that provide incentives for cooperation and information sharing. For example, the policymaker could structure the highway construction contract to include a cost-sharing mechanism, where both the public and the private firm share the burden of unforeseen expenses. This aligns the incentives of the parties and encourages them to collaborate in finding the most efficient solutions. Alternatively, establishing trust and long-term relationships can mitigate the risks associated with incomplete contracts. Repeated interactions can foster a reputation for fairness and cooperation, making both parties more willing to compromise when unforeseen circumstances arise. Ultimately, the challenge lies in finding the right balance between contractual rigidity and flexibility. Complete contracts, while theoretically desirable, are often impractical. Incomplete contracts, while acknowledging the inherent limitations of foresight, can create opportunities for opportunistic behavior. Navigating this complex landscape requires a deep understanding of the underlying principles of incentives, information, and bargaining power. As we consider these contractual intricacies, a lingering question arises. How do social norms and ethical considerations interact with formal contracts in shaping economic behavior? Perhaps, in our next exploration, we can consider the subtle but powerful influence of trust and reputation in navigating the complexities of the economic landscape. Chapter 17. The role of trust and reputation in agency relationships. The world of economics often strives for a stark mathematical precision. We build models, formulate equations, and seek to quantify human behavior. Yet, lurking beneath the surface of every principal-agent relationship lies a quieter, more nuanced force, trust. And shadowing every agent is the ever-present weight of their reputation. Consider the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of the agency problem. The principal, possessing the capital or the mandate, delegates authority to the agent. The agent, in turn, possesses specialized knowledge, perhaps access to information unavailable to the principal. This informational asymmetry creates fertile ground for opportunistic behavior. The agent, shielded by this informational advantage, may be tempted to act in their own self-interest, even at the expense of the principal's objectives. Contracts attempt to bridge this gap, to align incentives through carefully calibrated rewards and penalties. But contracts can only address what is foreseeable, what can be explicitly articulated and measured. They cannot account for every contingency, every subtle shift in circumstance. This is where trust enters the equation. Trust in this context can be viewed as a belief in the agent's good faith, a presumption that the agent will act responsibly and ethically, even when the contract is silent, even when the temptation to deviate is strong. Trust lubricates the relationship, reducing the need for exhaustive monitoring and elaborate contractual clauses. It allows for a more fluid and adaptable collaboration, fostering innovation and creativity. But how is trust cultivated? It is not simply willed into existence. It is earned, built gradually, through consistent behavior and transparent communication. A history of reliable performance, a willingness to share information openly, a demonstrated commitment to the principal's goals. These are the building blocks of trust. Conversely, a single act of betrayal can shatter trust, potentially irreparably damaging the relationship. Linked inextricably with trust is the concept of reputation. An agent's reputation is their publicly perceived character, a distillation of past actions and interactions. A good reputation is a valuable asset, attracting new principals and facilitating future collaborations. It signals to potential partners that the agent is reliable, trustworthy, and competent. The market for agents in many ways functions as a reputational clearinghouse. Agents are constantly being evaluated, judged on their performance and ethical conduct. This ongoing evaluation, whether formalized through performance reviews or simply whispered in the corridors of commerce, shapes their reputation and ultimately their opportunities. The classical economist might argue that reputation simply serves as an incentive mechanism, encouraging agents to act in the principal's best interest in order to maintain their market value. The policymaker might consider implementing regulations that promote transparency and accountability, strengthening the forces that reward good reputation and punish bad behavior. Indeed, both views hold merit. Reputation can be seen as a form of social contract, an implicit agreement to uphold certain standards of conduct. But the effectiveness of this social contract depends on the accuracy and availability of information. A market plagued by opacity and misinformation will struggle to properly reward good reputation and punish bad behavior. The flow of information, therefore, is crucial. Systems that facilitate the collection and dissemination of performance data, mechanisms that encourage whistleblowing and protect those who speak out against unethical conduct, these are essential for maintaining a healthy reputational ecosystem. Trust and reputation, then, are not merely sentimental concepts. They are powerful economic forces, shaping behavior and influencing the allocation of resources. They represent a crucial complement to formal contracts, providing a buffer against opportunistic behavior and fostering a more collaborative and productive environment. Principal agent problems in corporate governance. Shareholders versus management. Welcome, once again, to our quiet corner of economic thought. We've previously explored the efficient functioning of markets, but now we turn our attention to a subtle friction, a misalignment that can ripple through the entire corporate landscape, the principal agent problem. Think of it as a delicate clockwork mechanism, where one gear relies on another to perform a specific task. All is well when their interests align. But what happens when they don't? This, in essence, is the crux of the principal agent problem. In the realm of corporate governance, this tension often manifests between shareholders, the owners of the company, the principals and management, the individuals entrusted with running the company, the agents. Shareholders ideally want the company to maximize its value, to generate profits that ultimately flow back to them. Management, on the other hand, may have other priorities, perhaps related to their own power, prestige, or even simply a more relaxed lifestyle. Consider a scenario. A shareholder proposes a bold, innovative, but inherently risky project. Its success could dramatically increase the company's value. However, its failure could also significantly harm the company, perhaps even lead to a temporary dip in stock price. The manager, nearing retirement and perhaps risk-averse, might prefer a safer, less ambitious strategy, one that guarantees steady, but perhaps less spectacular, results. Here, the principal and agent are at odds. The root of this problem lies in three key aspects: diverging incentives, information asymmetry, and the difficulties inherent in monitoring. Incentives, as we've just seen, can be misaligned. Shareholders are driven by long-term value creation, while management might be more focused on short-term performance or personal gain. Information asymmetry refers to the fact that management often possesses far more detailed knowledge about the company's operations and prospects than the shareholders do. This informational advantage can be exploited to pursue self-serving agendas. Finally, the diffuse nature of shareholding, particularly in large corporations, makes effective monitoring challenging. Individual shareholders often lack the resources or the incentive to closely scrutinize management's actions. So, how do we address this delicate imbalance? The field of economics offers several potential solutions, focusing on incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Incentive alignment aims to bridge the gap between the principals and agents' interests. This can be achieved through various mechanisms, such as performance-based compensation, stock options, or even tying management salaries to shareholder returns. The policymaker understands the importance of incentivizing executives to make decisions that benefit all stakeholders. Enhanced monitoring seeks to reduce information asymmetry and deter opportunistic behavior. This can involve strengthening the role of the board of directors, who are responsible for overseeing management and representing shareholder interests. Independent audits, increased transparency in financial reporting, and even shareholder activism can all play a role in improving monitoring. The classical economists believed that well-designed contracts can provide a framework for defining expectations, allocating risks, and ensuring accountability. These contracts can specify performance targets, outline responsibilities, and establish mechanisms for dispute resolution. However, contracts are never perfect. They can be costly to enforce and may not anticipate every possible contingency. The challenge lies in designing contracts that are both effective and flexible, capable of adapting to changing circumstances. Moreover, the design of executive compensation contracts is notoriously complex. Simply tying pay to short-term stock performance can incentivize managers to manipulate earnings or take excessive risks. Finding the right balance between incentivizing performance and mitigating risk is a constant challenge. There is a constant search to discover how to best align the interests of shareholders and managers, a delicate dance to create a system that rewards ethical and long-term oriented decision-making. This intricate dance raises a crucial question for our continued exploration. How can we create corporate governance structures that not only maximize efficiency, but also promote ethical behavior and long-term sustainability? This is a question that will undoubtedly shape the future of our economic landscape. And so, as the gears slowly turn, we'll continue to explore these fundamental aspects of our economic existence. Executive compensation, controversy and challenges. Good evening. Tonight, we gently wade into the often turbulent waters of executive compensation. It's a topic fraught with ethical considerations, political posturing, and genuine economic anxiety. At its heart, however, lies a familiar, fundamental problem: the principal-agent problem. Imagine, if you will, a graceful dance, the dance between ownership and management. In a large corporation, the shareholders, the owners, are the principals. They entrust the management, the executives, as their agents, to act in their best interests, to maximize the value of their investment. However, like any dance, this one can be prone to missteps. The agents, while ideally aligned with the principals, may have their own objectives, their own rhythms that don't perfectly harmonize with the goals of the owners. This misalignment, this potential for diverging interests, is the essence of the principal-agent problem. The executives, possessing superior information about the firm's operations and prospects, might be tempted to prioritize short-term gains, even at the expense of long-term shareholder value. They might engage in empire building, seeking to expand the firm's size even if it doesn't translate to increased profitability. Or perhaps, they might simply become risk-averse, eschewing potentially lucrative but uncertain ventures to protect their own positions. How then can we guide this dance back into synchronicity? The answer lies in incentives, monitoring, and contracts, three pillars designed to bridge the gap between principals and agents. Incentives are the instruments of motivation. A carefully crafted compensation package can align the executive's self-interest with the shareholders' goals. Stock options, for instance, can incentivize executives to increase the firm's share price, directly benefiting both themselves and the owners. Performance-based bonuses, tied to specific metrics of profitability or growth, can further focus executives on value creation. However, these incentives must be thoughtfully designed. Overly aggressive bonus structures can lead to reckless risk-taking and even fraudulent behavior, as executives strive to meet targets at any cost. The incentives must reward genuine, sustainable value creation, not just fleeting gains. Monitoring, the second pillar, is the watchful eye that keeps the dance in check. Boards of directors, elected by the shareholders, are tasked with overseeing the executives and ensuring that they are acting in the best interests of the company. Independent auditors scrutinize the firm's financial statements, providing an objective assessment of its performance. And market analysts, through their research and commentary, shine a spotlight on executive decisions, holding them accountable for their actions. Effective monitoring requires transparency, independence, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. It demands that the board actively engage with the firm's strategy and performance, rather than simply rubber-stamping executive proposals. Contracts, the third pillar, are the formal agreements that define the terms of the dance. They specify the executive's responsibilities, their compensation, and the consequences of failing to meet expectations. Well-designed contracts can mitigate the principal-agent problem by clearly outlining the performance metrics that will be used to evaluate the executives, and by providing for clawback provisions, which allow the company to recover compensation if it is later discovered that the executives engaged in misconduct. These contracts, however, are often complex and highly negotiated, reflecting the power dynamics between the principals and the agents. Finding the right balance, crafting a contract that is both fair and effective, is a delicate art. The classical economist, centuries ago, would have perhaps favored simpler, market-driven solutions. The policymaker today might lean towards stricter regulations and greater oversight. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the balance. There is no single, universally applicable solution to the principal-agent problem in executive compensation. Each firm, each industry, each economic environment requires a tailored approach, a carefully calibrated system of incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Ultimately, the debate over executive compensation highlights a fundamental tension in the modern corporation. The tension between efficiency and fairness, between the pursuit of profit and the responsibility to stakeholders. It's a tension that continues to shape our economic landscape. And as we contemplate this complex interplay, we must ask ourselves, are these mechanisms, however carefully crafted, truly sufficient in aligning the incentives of those at the top with the broader goals of society? That question, perhaps, sets the stage for our next exploration into the role of corporate social responsibility. Good night. Mo. Chapter 20. Board of Directors. Monitoring the management team. Last time, we explored the multifaceted world of corporate governance, setting the stage for a deeper dive into the crucial role of the Board of Directors. Tonight, we'll consider the board not merely as a structural element, but as the primary mechanism for mitigating a fundamental economic challenge, the principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem, at its heart, arises from a separation of ownership and control. The shareholders, the principals, own the company. The management team, the agents, runs it. Ideally, the agents should act solely in the best interests of the principals, maximizing shareholder value. However, human nature and differing incentives often conspire to create a divergence. The agent might prioritize personal gain, empire building, or even simply shirking difficult decisions, all at the potential expense of the principal. This is not necessarily malicious. Often, it's simply a matter of skewed priorities, born from a different perspective within the intricate system of the corporation. Consider the incentives at play. A CEO, for instance, might be incentivized to pursue short-term profits to boost their annual bonus, even if it damages the company's long-term prospect. Or, a manager might be reluctant to take risks, fearing failure and its impact on their career, even if those risks, if successful, would significantly benefit the shareholders. These misalignments are not isolated incidents. They are inherent within the structure of the modern corporation. Here enters the board of directors. Their primary function, in this context, is to monitor the management team, acting as the shareholders' representative. This monitoring takes many forms. It involves reviewing financial statements, scrutinizing strategic plans, and evaluating the performance of key executives. But it goes beyond mere oversight. The board must proactively ensure that the management team's incentives are aligned with the shareholders' interests. How is this alignment achieved? Primarily, through contracts, carefully designed to reward desired behaviors and penalize undesirable ones. Executive compensation packages, for instance, often include stock options or performance-based bonuses. These are intended to tie the manager's personal wealth directly to the company's success, thereby aligning their interests with those of the shareholders. The classical economist would see this as a beautiful application of rational self-interest. harnessed for the greater good of the corporation. However, crafting these contracts is an art, not a science. A poorly designed compensation plan can inadvertently create perverse incentives. For example, a CEO incentivized solely on revenue growth might pursue acquisitions at inflated prices, benefiting them in the short term, but burdening the company with debt for years to come. The policymaker must thus tread carefully, balancing the desire for clear incentives with the need to avoid unintended consequences. It's a delicate dance, a constant calibration within the economic system. Effective monitoring also requires a degree of independence. A board dominated by insiders, executives who also work for the company, is less likely to challenge the management team. Independent directors, individuals with no other ties to the company, bring a fresh perspective and a greater willingness to ask tough questions. They act as a crucial check and balance, ensuring that the management team remains accountable. Furthermore, the board's role extends beyond simply reacting to problems. A proactive board anticipates potential conflicts of interest and establishes clear ethical guidelines. It fosters a culture of transparency and accountability, where managers feel comfortable raising concerns and challenging the status quo. This requires not just formal structures, but also a commitment to open communication and robust debate. The board is, in essence, the linchpin in the corporate governance system. A strong, independent, and well-informed board can effectively mitigate the principal-agent problem, ensuring that the management team acts in the best interests of the shareholders. A weak or ineffective board, on the other hand, can leave the company vulnerable to mismanagement and even outright fraud. This echoes the theme of balance we've seen before, a constant dynamic between competing forces. As we conclude this chapter, consider this. How can boards adapt to the increasingly complex and rapidly changing business environment? Are traditional monitoring mechanisms sufficient to address the challenges of globalization, technological disruption, and evolving stakeholder expectations? This question will undoubtedly lead us toward the next phase of our economic understanding, one where we will consider new types of value beyond just monetary. Chapter 21. Institutional Investors. Their role in corporate governance. Last time, we considered the individual investor, their hopes and their anxieties as they navigate the market. Now, let us shift our gaze to a different kind of player, the institutional investor. Pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds. These are the titans of capital, entities managing immense pools of money on behalf of others. And their involvement throws the principal-agent problem into sharp, sometimes unsettling, relief. The principal-agent problem, at its heart, is a conflict of interest. Imagine the relationship between a shareholder, the principal, and the company's management, the agent. Shareholders entrust their capital to management, expecting them to act in the shareholders' best interests, maximizing returns and safeguarding the value of the firm. However, management might have different incentives. They may prioritize short-term gains for bonuses, empire building through acquisitions, or even personal perks, all at the expense of long-term shareholder value. This is the essence of the principal-agent problem. Institutional investors, by virtue of their size and influence, are uniquely positioned to mitigate this conflict. They represent a vast number of individual shareholders, often with long-term investment horizons. This gives them both the incentive and the power to engage actively in corporate governance, the system by which companies are directed and controlled. But the waters here are deep and often murky. One crucial aspect is incentives. What drives an institutional investor to actively monitor and engage with the companies they invest in? It's not always altruism. Often, it's the very real fear of underperformance. If a pension fund, for example, consistently delivers poor returns, its beneficiaries, the pensioners, will suffer. This creates a direct incentive for the fund managers to ensure that the companies they invest in are well managed and focused on long-term value creation. Monitoring is another critical piece of the puzzle. How do institutional investors keep tabs on management? They may attend shareholder meetings, scrutinize financial reports, engage with independent analysts, and even communicate directly with company executives and board members. They are like vigilant shepherds, watching over their flock of investments, ready to intervene if they sense danger. However, monitoring is costly. It requires time, expertise, and resources. This is where the scale of institutional investors becomes an advantage. They can afford to dedicate teams of analysts to research and monitor their investments, something individual shareholders simply cannot do. Think of it as economies of scale applied to corporate governance. And then there are contracts. The relationship between shareholders and management is, in essence, a contractual one, governed by laws, regulations, and corporate charters. Institutional investors can use their influence to advocate for stronger corporate governance provisions, such as independent boards of directors, executive compensation tied to long-term performance, and shareholder rights to vote on key decisions. These are the safeguards that can help align the interests of management with those of shareholders. Active engagement by institutional investors can take many forms, from quietly raising concerns with management behind closed doors to publicly challenging company decisions at shareholder meetings. In some cases, institutional investors may even launch proxy fights, seeking to replace board members or force through significant changes in corporate strategy. This is where the power of collective action truly comes into play. Yet, challenges remain. One is the problem of free riding. Some institutional investors may choose to sit on the sidelines, benefiting from the monitoring efforts of others without contributing themselves. This can undermine the effectiveness of corporate governance. Another challenge is the potential for short-termism. If institutional investors are overly focused on quarterly earnings, they may pressure management to make decisions that boost short-term profits at the expense of long-term sustainability. Furthermore, the legal and regulatory frameworks governing institutional investor activity vary significantly across countries, impacting their ability to effectively engage in corporate governance. The effectiveness of these investors as monitors of corporate governance is an ongoing debate and topic of substantial scholarly work. So we see that institutional investors are powerful actors in the corporate governance landscape. They possess the scale, resources, and incentives to mitigate the principal agent problem, but their role is complex and multifaceted. As we look ahead, we must ask, how can we further strengthen the framework to ensure that institutional investors are truly acting as responsible stewards of capital, promoting long-term value creation for all stakeholders? What new models of ownership and governance are on the horizon? These are the questions that will guide our exploration in the chapters to come. Chapter 22. Principal Agent. Problems in Financial Markets. Investors versus Fund Managers. Welcome back. Last time, we explored the subtle dance of asymmetric information in lending markets. Now, let us turn our gaze toward the financial markets, specifically the often murky relationship between investors, the principals, and fund managers, their agents. Here, the seeds of principal agent problems sprout, and sometimes blossom into full-blown agency costs, a drag on the efficiency of the entire system. Think of it as a delicate ecosystem where incentives, monitoring, and contracts must be carefully calibrated to maintain equilibrium. The core issue, as always, stems from diverging interests. The investor, whether an individual saving for retirement or a pension fund managing vast sums, seeks the highest possible risk-adjusted return. Their goal is simple: maximize the growth of their capital within acceptable risk parameters. The fund manager, however, operates within a more complex landscape. While ideally aligned with the investor's objectives, they also face their own set of incentives, some of which may conflict with the investor's best interests. These conflicts are the fertile ground for the principal agent problem. Consider the manager's career concerns. A fund manager might prioritize short-term performance to attract new investors and secure bonuses, even if it means taking on excessive risks that could ultimately harm the portfolio in the long run. This is a clear misalignment of incentives. The investor seeks sustained, steady growth, while the manager might be tempted to chase quick wins, creating a volatile and potentially unsustainable investment strategy. It's a bit like navigating a river. The investor prefers a steady current leading to the ocean, while the manager is drawn to the whitewater rapids, promising a brief burst of speed, but also the risk of capsizing. Furthermore, managers may engage in closet indexing, a practice where they subtly mimic the performance of a benchmark index while charging active management fees. This represents a failure of effort. The investor is paying for expertise and active decision-making, but receives a passively managed portfolio in disguise. It's akin to hiring an architect to design a bespoke home but receiving a cookie-cutter model instead. The resources are misallocated, and the potential for value creation is squandered. So, what tools do we have to mitigate these principal agent problems? The answer lies in a thoughtful combination of incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Incentive structures, such as performance-based fees, can align the manager's interests more closely with the investors. However, these structures must be carefully designed to avoid unintended consequences. For instance, rewarding managers solely based on short-term returns can incentivize excessive risk-taking. A more nuanced approach might involve clawback provisions, requiring managers to return previously earned bonuses if their subsequent performance deteriorates. Monitoring, the second crucial element, involves rigorous oversight of the manager's activities. This can include regular performance reviews, detailed portfolio analysis, and independent audits. The aim is to detect any deviations from the agreed-upon investment strategy and to ensure that the manager is acting in the investor's best interests. Think of it as carefully tending a garden. Regular pruning and weeding prevent unwanted growth and ensure the healthy development of the desired plants. The third tool, contracts, serve as the foundation for the entire relationship. A well-defined investment management agreement should clearly outline the manager's responsibilities, investment objectives, risk parameters, and fee structure. It should also specify the circumstances under which the investor can terminate the agreement if the manager fails to meet expectations. These contracts are akin to the blueprints of our house, defining the structure and rules of engagement. However, even the most meticulously crafted contracts cannot completely eliminate the possibility of agency problems. The human element remains. Trust, transparency, and open communication are also crucial. The investor must foster a culture of accountability and ethical behavior within the management firm. One final thought before we conclude this chapter. The rise of algorithmic trading and artificial intelligence in financial markets presents both opportunities and challenges in the context of principal-agent problems. While algorithms can potentially reduce human biases and improve efficiency, they also introduce new layers of complexity and opacity. How do we ensure that these algorithms are aligned with the investor's interests and that they are not susceptible to manipulation or unintended consequences? This is a question we will need to ponder as we move forward, navigating the increasingly complex landscape of modern finance. It beckons us towards the next phase of this exploration, a journey into the interplay of technology and economic agency. The agency costs of debt, lenders versus borrowers. We've examined the elegant structure of capital, its theoretical perfection under certain conditions. But now, let's descend from the theoretical heights and explore the murkier, more human landscape of debt financing. Here, imperfections reign, primarily manifested as agency costs, born from the inherent tension between lenders and borrowers. Agency costs, at their heart, are a consequence of the principal-agent problem. Think of a river system. The principal, in this case the lender, entrusts their resources, the flow of capital, to the agent, the borrower, who navigates the riverbed of the business. The ideal is a smooth, efficient current, with the lender receiving their due share of the river's bounty. However, the agent, focused on their own plot of land along the riverbank, might be tempted to divert the flow for personal gain, leaving less for the lender downstream. This divergence of interests is the crux of the problem. The incentives of the borrower and lender are rarely perfectly aligned. The borrower seeks to maximize their own wealth, which may involve taking actions that, while beneficial to them, increase the risk of default and thus harm the lender. This could manifest in several ways. The borrower might, for instance, undertake excessively risky projects, gambles with the lender's money, essentially, that offer potentially high returns, but also a significant chance of failure. This is akin to the borrower damming up part of the river, creating a private lake, but jeopardizing the downstream flow. Another manifestation of this agency problem is underinvestment. A borrower might forgo profitable investment opportunities if the benefits primarily accrue to the lender. Imagine the borrower is faced with investing in a new irrigation system along the riverbank. This benefits everyone, but the lion's share of the increased crop yield goes to paying down the debt. The borrower, disheartened, might simply let the land go fallow, a loss for all involved. So, how does one mitigate these agency costs? The answer lies in three interwoven strategies: incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Think of them as the regulatory bodies, surveyors, and legal agreements governing our river system. Incentives can be crafted to better align the interests of borrowers and lenders. For example, incorporating covenants into debt agreements that restrict the borrower's activities, limitations on dividend payouts, restrictions on taking on additional debt, act as guardrails, preventing excessive risk-taking. These are like carefully placed stones, guiding the flow and preventing unwanted diversions. The borrower might also be offered a lower interest rate in exchange for adhering to certain performance targets, incentivizing prudent management. Monitoring is the lender's watchful eye, ensuring the borrower adheres to the agreed-upon terms. This involves regular audits, reviews of financial statements, and ongoing communication. The lender, through these mechanisms, gains a better understanding of the borrower's actions and can intervene if necessary. Think of this as a team of surveyors, constantly assessing the river's flow and identifying potential problems before they escalate. Contracts, the cornerstone of the relationship, define the rights and responsibilities of both parties. A well-drafted debt contract anticipates potential conflicts and provides clear remedies. It specifies the terms of the loan, the collateral pledged, and the actions that constitute a default. This acts as the legal framework governing the entire river system, ensuring that disputes are resolved fairly and efficiently. The classical economist advocated for comprehensive contracts as the ultimate safeguard against opportunistic behavior. However, even the most sophisticated contracts and rigorous monitoring cannot eliminate agency costs entirely. There will always be some degree of information asymmetry, some uncertainty about the future, and some scope for opportunistic behavior. The policymaker grapples with the ever-present challenge of balancing the benefits of debt financing with the inherent risks of agency costs. Overly restrictive covenants, while protecting the lender, can stifle the borrower's entrepreneurial spirit and hinder value creation. Too little monitoring, on the other hand, can leave the lender vulnerable to exploitation. Thus, the optimal level of debt financing and the associated agency costs becomes a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between risk and reward, constraint and freedom. The flow of capital, like a mighty river, must be carefully managed, guided by the principles of incentives, monitoring, and contracts, to ensure that it benefits all stakeholders. But as we contemplate the intricate dance between debt and equity, one question lingers: how does the informational landscape itself, the availability and transparency of data, reshape the agency problem and influence the very nature of these financial relationships? That will be the gentle current we follow next. Chapter 24. Credit rating agencies, their impact on financial stability. Good evening. Tonight, we'll explore the pivotal role credit rating agencies play in the financial ecosystem, examining their influence through the lens of principal-agent problems. Think of these agencies as arbiters of risk, bestowing judgments upon borrowers, both corporate and sovereign, that ripple outwards, affecting investment decisions and, ultimately, financial stability. But are they truly independent arbiters? Or are they swayed by forces that create a conflict of interest? That's the question we'll gently unpack. The core of the problem lies in the issuer pays model. In most cases, the entity seeking a credit rating, the issuer of bonds, for instance, is the one who pays the agency for its services. This arrangement, while seemingly straightforward, immediately introduces a principal-agent dynamic. The agency, the agent, is theoretically acting on behalf of the principals, the investors who rely on the ratings to assess the creditworthiness of the issuer. However, the agent's financial incentive is tied directly to the issuer, creating a potential conflict of interest. The agency might be tempted to inflate ratings to secure future business from the issuer, even if it means misrepresenting the true risk. Let's consider this through the prism of incentives. The issuer is incentivized to obtain the highest possible rating, as this translates into lower borrowing costs. The agency, under the issuer pays model, is incentivized to provide a favorable rating to maintain a strong relationship with the issuer and secure future contracts. The investor, on the other hand, is incentivized to make informed decisions based on accurate risk assessments. The problem arises when the agency's incentive structure deviates from the investor's needs, creating a misalignment that can lead to systemic distortions. It's a delicate balance, easily disrupted. Monitoring, therefore, becomes crucial. Who is monitoring the credit rating agencies to ensure they are acting in the best interest of the investors? Regulators, naturally, play a role, attempting to establish rules and guidelines to prevent conflicts of interest and promote transparency. However, regulation alone is often insufficient. The complexity of financial instruments and the rapid pace of innovation can outstrip regulatory oversight. The market itself can also exert a form of monitoring, though this mechanism is often reactive, responding only after a crisis has unfolded. Reputation, too, serves as a monitoring device. Agencies are aware that a loss of credibility can damage their long-term prospects. But during periods of intense market exuberance, the immediate lure of profit can outweigh concerns about reputational risk. Contracts also play a part. Agreements between issuers and agencies are typically structured to protect the agency from liability, even in cases of demonstrably flawed ratings. This limited liability, while perhaps necessary to encourage agencies to take on risky assessments, further weakens the incentive for accuracy. It creates a moral hazard. The agency can reap the rewards of issuing favorable ratings without bearing the full cost of potential failures. The system, in a sense, is designed to absorb shocks, but it can also amplify them when the agency's judgments are systematically incorrect. The impact of these principal agent problems on financial stability can be profound. Inflated ratings can lead to excessive risk-taking, as investors are lulled into a false sense of security. Capital flows are misdirected, channeled into assets that appear safer than they truly are. When the inevitable correction occurs, the consequences can be devastating, triggering widespread losses and undermining confidence in the entire financial system. The classical economist might say that ultimately, the market will correct these misalignments, but the cost of such a correction can be very high indeed. So, how can we mitigate these principal agent problems? Strengthening regulatory oversight is one option, but we must be mindful of unintended consequences, such as stifling innovation or creating excessive compliance burdens. Encouraging greater competition among rating agencies could also help, but this raises questions about the potential for a race to the bottom, with agencies competing on price rather than accuracy. Ultimately, a multifaceted approach is needed, combining robust regulation, market discipline, and a renewed emphasis on ethical conduct within the rating agencies themselves. The policymaker is often left wondering, how can we best align the incentives of these powerful actors to promote a more stable and resilient financial system? Principal agent problems in healthcare. Doctors versus patients. Welcome back, fellow travelers on the path of economic understanding. Last time, we considered the complexities of information asymmetry in markets. Tonight, we delve into another facet of this challenge, the principal agent problem, specifically within the crucial context of healthcare, a realm where knowledge disparities and inherent vulnerabilities are often heightened. Imagine, if you will, a flowing river. The principal, in our case the patient, desires a specific outcome: improved health, relief from suffering. The agent, the doctor, is entrusted with navigating the river, applying their specialized knowledge and skill to reach that desired destination. But what happens when the river's course isn't perfectly clear? When the patient lacks the map, and the doctor holds the key to both the navigation and the map itself? This, in essence, is the principal agent problem. It arises when one party delegates authority to another who may have different interests or, crucially, different information than the principal. The challenge lies in aligning the agent's actions with the principal's goals, despite these differences. Consider the incentives at play. The patient seeks the most effective and cost-efficient treatment to restore their health. The doctor, however, may be influenced by factors such as the fee structure, their professional reputation, or even the desire to avoid potential liability. These incentives, might not always perfectly align with the patient's best interests. One significant aspect of the principal agent problem in healthcare is the information asymmetry we discussed earlier. Patients often lack the medical knowledge to fully evaluate the doctor's recommendations. They rely heavily on the doctor's expertise, creating a power imbalance. This information gap can lead to moral hazard, where the doctor, knowing the patient is less informed, might provide services that are not strictly necessary or are overly expensive. Think of unnecessary tests or prescribing brand-name medications when generics would suffice. Moreover, the inherent complexity of medical science makes it difficult for patients to effectively monitor the doctor's actions. Unlike, say, hiring a contractor to build a fence where the finished product is readily visible, the efficacy of a medical treatment can be uncertain and difficult to assess objectively. Even with a successful outcome, it's often challenging to definitively attribute it solely to the doctor's actions, as lifestyle factors and the body's natural healing processes also play a role. So, what mechanisms can we employ to mitigate these principal agent problems in healthcare? One approach is to strengthen contracts, not necessarily legal documents in the traditional sense, but rather implicit or explicit agreements that define the responsibilities and expectations of both parties. For example, capitation models, where doctors receive a fixed payment per patient regardless of the number of services provided, can incentivize doctors to focus on preventive care and cost-effective treatments, reducing the temptation for overservicing. However, they can also lead to underservicing if not carefully managed. Another mechanism is to enhance monitoring. This can take various forms, such as peer review, where doctors evaluate each other's performance, the use of standardized treatment guidelines, or even patient satisfaction surveys. The rise of electronic health records and data analytics also provides opportunities to identify patterns of care that might indicate potential inefficiencies or inappropriate practices. The classical economist might propose relying more heavily on market forces, empowering patients with greater information and choice. They might advocate for increased transparency in pricing and quality metrics, enabling patients to make more informed decisions. However, the unique nature of healthcare, the urgency of need, the emotional vulnerability of patients, and the inherent uncertainty of medical outcomes limits the applicability of purely market-based solutions. The policymaker often grapples with the delicate balance between cost containment, quality assurance, and patient access. They might implement regulations to control prices, mandate certain treatments, or establish professional standards. However, these interventions can also create unintended consequences, such as reducing innovation, limiting patient choice, or creating bureaucratic inefficiencies. The challenge, then, is to design healthcare systems that align the incentives of doctors and patients, while acknowledging the inherent information asymmetries and the complexities of medical science. It's a continuous process of adaptation and refinement, requiring careful consideration of the trade-offs involved. As we close this chapter, consider this. If the patient, the principal, cannot perfectly see the river's course, and the doctor, the agent, is entrusted to navigate it, what other guiding stars, beyond contracts and monitoring, might help us reach the destination of improved health and well-being? What role might trust, shared values, and a redefinition of the doctor-patient relationship play in overcoming these persistent principal-agent challenges? We'll explore these questions and others as we continue our journey together. Chapter 26: Insurance Markets. Adverse Selection and Moral Hazard in Healthcare. Tonight, we consider the intricate relationship between those who need healthcare and those who provide insurance, a landscape rife with what economists term principal-agent problems. Imagine a delicate scale, carefully balanced. On one side sits the principal, entrusting their well-being, their resources, to another. On the other rests the agent, tasked with acting in the principal's best interest. But what happens when these interests diverge, when the flow of information is not seamless, when incentives pull in opposing directions? This imbalance, this potential for asymmetry, is the essence of the principal-agent conundrum. Now, let us gently introduce the core issues within healthcare insurance: adverse selection and moral hazard. Adverse selection arises when individuals with a higher risk of needing healthcare are more likely to purchase insurance than those who are healthier. The insurance company, in this scenario, becomes burdened with a pool of high-risk individuals, potentially leading to higher premiums for everyone, or even market collapse. It's as if the river of risk flows unevenly, creating a stagnant pool of uncertainty. The key element here is information asymmetry. The individual possesses private information about their health status that the insurance company cannot perfectly observe. This is akin to a subtle distortion in the mirror, where the true reflection of health risk is obscure. The classical economist might advocate for complete information, a utopian ideal where perfect knowledge dissolves the problem. However, in reality, such transparency is rarely achievable. Moral hazard, on the other hand, emerges after the insurance contract is in place. It refers to the tendency for individuals to change their behavior once they are insured, often leading to increased healthcare utilization. Knowing they are covered, individuals might be less diligent about preventative care, or more likely to seek out expensive treatments, knowing that the insurance company will bear a significant portion of the cost. Think of it as a ship sailing with less caution, knowing a rescue vessel is nearby. The root of this lies in altered incentives. The individual's marginal cost of healthcare decreases when they are insured, creating a temptation to overconsume. The policymaker might suggest regulations, such as co-payments or deductibles, to restore a sense of personal responsibility and encourage more prudent healthcare decisions. These measures are like strategically placed dams, regulating the flow of healthcare utilization. However, these too have drawbacks, potentially deterring individuals from seeking necessary care. So, what are the possible solutions to these principal agent problems? Incentives, monitoring, and contracts form the cornerstones of the economic response. Incentives. Aligning the agent's interests with the principals is paramount. Risk-adjusted premiums, for example, can partially address adverse selection by charging higher premiums to individuals with pre-existing conditions. For moral hazard, wellness programs and premium discounts for healthy behaviors can encourage responsible decision-making. Monitoring. Insurance companies can employ various monitoring strategies to track healthcare utilization patterns and identify potential instances of overconsumption or fraud. This might involve scrutinizing claims data, requiring prior authorization for certain procedures, or implementing case management programs. This is like careful navigation, keeping the course steady by observing the surrounding currents. Contracts. The structure of the insurance contract itself can play a crucial role in mitigating principal-agent problems. Contracts with deductibles, co-insurance, and limitations on coverage encourage individuals to share in the cost of healthcare, reducing the incentive for overconsumption. Contracts can also be designed to reward providers for delivering high-quality, cost-effective care. Ultimately, the challenge lies in finding the optimal balance between providing access to affordable healthcare and managing the inherent risks associated with insurance markets. It's a continuous process of refinement, of adjusting the scales to achieve a more equitable and efficient allocation of resources. The flow of healthcare economics never rests. It ebbs and flows, constantly presenting new challenges and requiring adaptive solutions. Chapter 27. Managed Care Organizations. Balancing Cost and Quality. Good evening. Last time, we explored the burgeoning landscape of healthcare finance, observing its inherent complexities. Tonight, we navigate a particularly intriguing channel within that landscape: managed care organizations, or MCOs. Our focal point will be the ever-present, often subtle, economic force known as the principal-agent problem, a challenge that shapes incentives, necessitates vigilant monitoring, and demands carefully crafted contracts. At its heart, the principal-agent problem arises whenever one party, the principal, delegates authority to another, the agent, to act on their behalf. The core issue? The agent's interests may not perfectly align with those of the principal. In healthcare, this misalignment manifests in myriad ways within MCOs. Consider the physician operating within a managed care network. The patient is the principal, delegating healthcare decisions to the physician, the agent. However, the MCO, seeking to control costs, introduces another layer of agency. The physician now also acts, to some extent, as an agent for the MCO. This multi-layered agency creates a delicate balance. The classical economist might argue that perfectly rational agents, driven by self-interest, will inevitably exploit information asymmetries to their advantage. The physician, possessing superior medical knowledge, could overprescribe, order unnecessary tests, or conversely, underprovide care to meet cost containment targets set by the MCO, while the patient, lacking the expertise to fully evaluate the physician's decisions, remains vulnerable. To mitigate these inherent risks, MCOA employ a variety of mechanisms, incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Incentives are designed to align the physician's behavior with the MCO's objectives. These might include capitation, where physicians receive a fixed payment per patient, regardless of the services provided, or fee-for-service arrangements coupled with utilization review. Each system presents its own set of challenges. Capitation may incentivize undertreatment, while fee-for-service, even with review, can still encourage overutilization, albeit with greater oversight. Monitoring acts as a crucial safeguard. MCOs track various metrics, such as hospital admission rates, referral patterns, and patient satisfaction scores. This data provides insights into physician behavior and allows for the identification of potential deviations from established guidelines. The policymaker, seeking to ensure quality of care, might advocate for increased transparency and data sharing, empowering patients to make more informed choices and hold MCOs accountable. Contracts, the legal scaffolding upon which MCOs operate, define the rights and responsibilities of each party. These agreements specify the services covered, the payment structure, and the quality standards expected of participating providers. However, even the most meticulously crafted contract cannot fully eliminate the principal agent problem. The challenge lies in designing contracts that are both enforceable and flexible enough to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of medical knowledge and patient needs. Ultimately, the success of managed care hinges on striking a delicate balance between cost containment and quality of care. The principal agent problem serves as a constant reminder of the potential for misalignment, demanding careful attention to incentives, robust monitoring, and thoughtful contract design. Each approach, however, introduces its own unintended consequences, and the system remains a work in progress. And as we conclude our exploration of managed care organizations tonight, a question lingers in the air. How does the increasing influence of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, reshape the principal agent dynamic in healthcare? Will AI-powered diagnostic tools and treatment recommendations empower patients, or will they further complicate the already intricate web of agency relationships? We shall delve into this question next time as we navigate the digital frontier of healthcare economics. Good night. Chapter 28. Principal Agent Problems in Politics. Voters versus Politicians. Ah, yes, we've touched upon the dance of incentives in the corporate world. Now, let's turn our gaze to a stage perhaps even grander and more complex: the political arena. Here, the same fundamental problem that plagued the shareholders and executives, the principal agent problem, manifests in the relationship between voters and politicians. Allow your thoughts to settle, and let us unravel this intricate web together. The core of the principal agent problem, as we've discussed, rests on the divergence of interests and information asymmetry. In a business context, it's the shareholders wanting the executives to act in their best interests, maximizing profit and shareholder value. But the executives might have their own goals: higher salaries, empire building, or perhaps just a more leisurely work life. Monitoring their actions and aligning their incentives with those of the shareholders becomes a crucial, often delicate, task. So too, in politics. Think of it this way: the voters are the principals. They desire effective governance, public services, and policies that improve their lives. They elect politicians, the agents, to represent them and implement these desires. But, just as in the corporate world, the agent, the politician, may have differing priorities. Re-election, personal gain, party loyalty, or ideological convictions can all pull the politician's compass away from the true north of the voters' collective will. the flow of intent diverges. One significant challenge is the vast information asymmetry. Voters, often busy with their own lives, can't possibly possess complete information about the politicians' actions, intentions, and the complex workings of government. They rely on news reports, social media, and anecdotal evidence, imperfect and often biased sources. The politician, on the other hand, has privileged access to information, shaping the narrative, and potentially concealing actions that contradict their promises. Consider the promises made during election campaigns. A politician might pledge to lower taxes, improve education, or protect the environment. These are signals meant to attract voters. But once elected, the politician may face unforeseen circumstances, conflicting priorities, or simply a change of heart. The contract, implied though it may be, is difficult to enforce. The voter, unlike a shareholder armed with legal rights, has limited recourse beyond the next election cycle. What mechanisms exist to align the incentives of politicians with those of voters? Elections themselves are a primary form of monitoring. The threat of being voted out of office is intended to keep politicians accountable. However, this is a blunt instrument. Elections are infrequent, and voters often make choices based on a multitude of factors, not solely on the politician's past performance. Furthermore, the nature of political discourse often muddies the waters. Partisan polarization can lead voters to support candidates regardless of their actual effectiveness, simply because they identify with the same party. Media outlets, with their own biases and agendas, can distort the information landscape, making it even harder for voters to assess a politician's true record. Laws and regulations, such as campaign finance laws and ethics rules, attempt to constrain the behavior of politicians and promote transparency. However, these measures are often imperfect and subject to loopholes. The political process itself can be used to weaken or circumvent these regulations, creating a perpetual cycle of reform and counter-reform. Think of it as a delicate balancing act, constantly shifting. The design of political institutions also plays a crucial role. Systems with checks and balances, such as a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, are intended to prevent any one individual or group from accumulating too much power and acting solely in their own self-interest. Federalism, with its division of power between national and regional governments, can also enhance accountability by providing voters with multiple avenues for influencing policy. However, even with these safeguards, the principal-agent problem persists. The inherent complexities of governing, the diversity of voter interests, and the ever-present allure of power create a constant tension between the desires of the voters and the actions of their elected officials. It is a system of flows, redirections, and occasional damming. So, as we conclude this chapter, consider this. How can we design political systems that are more resilient to the distortions caused by the principal-agent problem? How can we empower voters with better information and stronger tools for holding their representatives accountable? And, perhaps most importantly, what role does civic engagement play in bridging the gap between the governed and the governors? As we move forward, we will turn our attention to the role of the state in addressing market failures and promoting social welfare. What intricate dance of power and influence awaits us there? Chapter 29, Lobbying and Special Interest Groups, Influencing Political Outcomes. Welcome back. Last time, we explored the inherent challenges in allocating resources through government intervention, recognizing the potential for unintended consequences. Tonight, we delve into another facet of this intricate web, the influence of lobbying and special interest groups, and how their actions can be elegantly explained through the lens of principal-agent problems. The world of politics, like any market, involves actors with differing objectives. Consider the elected official, the agent, entrusted by the electorate, the principal, to act in their best interests. Ideally, the official champions policies that benefit the broad population. However, special interest groups, often representing narrow but intensely motivated constituencies, introduce a wrinkle into this simple equation. They seek to influence the official's decisions, potentially diverting them from the broader public good. This divergence forms the heart of a principal-agent problem. The electorate, as the principal, finds it difficult to perfectly monitor the actions of their agent. Information asymmetry is key. The interest group possesses specialized knowledge and resources, enabling them to present a compelling, albeit possibly biased, case to the official. Furthermore, the electorate is often rationally ignorant. That is, the cost of acquiring detailed knowledge about every policy decision outweighs the individual benefit of doing so. Now, consider the incentives at play. Interest groups can offer various inducements to sway the official. These incentives can be direct, such as campaign contributions or promises of future support. They can also be indirect, such as providing research that supports a particular policy position or mobilizing public opinion through media campaigns. The official, facing re-election pressures and the need for resources to govern effectively, may find these incentives difficult to resist, even if they conflict with the broader public interest. Monitoring in this context is the electorate's ability to hold the official accountable. A free press, transparent campaign finance laws, and active civic organizations all play a crucial role in monitoring the official's behavior. However, monitoring is rarely perfect. Interest groups can strategically obfuscate their activities, making it difficult for the electorate to fully understand the motivations behind a particular policy decision. The complexity of policy itself often acts as a shield, allowing less visible deals to be struck. Contracts, in the political realm, are less formal than in traditional markets, yet no less important. The social contract is a shared understanding between the electorate and their elected officials. However, this contract is often vague and open to interpretation. Interest groups exploit this ambiguity by framing their agenda as being aligned with the broader public interest. They engage in framing, a form of linguistic engineering, where ideas are repackaged to create a desired response. The classical economist of old, though focused on rational actors, would have recognized this as a type of systematic cognitive bias in large-scale political economy. Regulation attempts to address this principal-agent problem. Campaign finance laws, for example, seek to limit the influence of money in politics. Lobbying disclosure laws aim to increase transparency by requiring interest groups to report their activities. However, these regulations are often imperfect and can be circumvented through creative means. The flow of influence, it seems, always finds a way. The policymaker, in considering these issues, must strive to create a system where the incentives of elected officials are aligned with the interests of the electorate. This requires not only robust monitoring mechanisms, but also a political culture that values transparency and accountability. Furthermore, it demands a citizenry that is engaged and informed, willing to critically evaluate the claims of special interest groups. Ultimately, the tension between the principals and the agents in the political sphere is an ongoing one. The system requires constant adjustment and vigilance to maintain a semblance of equilibrium, and the impact extends far beyond simple electoral results, influencing the very fabric of economic activity. So, as we consider how this tension plays out, let us ask ourselves, to what extent does the pursuit of self-interest by these groups truly warp the market forces we hope to find? How might a more refined understanding of behavioral economics help us shape the incentives within the system and create a more equitable outcome? Bureaucracy and public administration, efficiency and accountability. Good evening. As we gently transition from the considerations of market failures and their corrective measures, let us turn our gaze to the inner workings of the institutions designed to enact these remedies: bureaucracy and public administration. Within their complex structures, we encounter a familiar, yet often magnified challenge: the principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem, at its heart, is a question of alignment. The principal, in our context, often the citizenry or elected officials, delegates authority to an agent, a bureaucrat, a public administrator, to act on their behalf. The underlying assumption is that the agent will faithfully execute the principal's wishes, striving to achieve the desired policy outcomes. However, the reality is often more nuanced. Consider, for a moment, the delicate dance of incentives. The agent, unlike a perfectly rational robot, is also driven by personal motivations: career advancement, job security, perhaps even a genuine desire to serve the public good. However, these motivations may not perfectly overlap with the principal's overarching goals. The bureaucrat might, for instance, prioritize expanding their department's budget, even if a more streamlined, cost-effective approach would better serve the taxpayers. This misalignment stems from asymmetric information. The agent often possesses superior knowledge about the practicalities of policy implementation, creating opportunities for opportunistic behavior, a term economists use to describe actions that benefit the agent at the expense of the principal. This brings us to the essential role of monitoring. If we cannot perfectly align incentives, we must, at the very least, observe and evaluate the agent's actions. This is the realm of audits, performance reviews, and oversight committees. Yet, effective monitoring is far from straightforward. It requires establishing clear, measurable metrics of success, a task fraught with challenges when dealing with complex social programs. Furthermore, monitoring itself incurs costs, both in terms of resources and the potential for stifling innovation and risk-taking. A bureaucrat, constantly under scrutiny, may become overly cautious, prioritizing compliance over creativity. Contracts, in their broadest sense, represent formal agreements designed to specify the terms of the principal-agent relationship. These can range from detailed employment contracts outlining job responsibilities and performance targets to sophisticated regulatory frameworks governing the behavior of government agencies. The goal is to provide clear incentives for agents to act in accordance with the principal's interests. However, the design of effective contracts within the public sector is notoriously difficult. Unlike the private sector, where profit maximization provides a relatively straightforward metric for success, public sector goals are often multifaceted and difficult to quantify. How do we measure the effectiveness of a social welfare program? How do we incentivize a police officer to balance crime prevention with respect for individual rights? These questions highlight the limitations of purely contractual approaches. We often rely on a combination of formal rules, ethical codes, and professional norms to guide the behavior of public servants. The classical economist might advocate for minimizing the scope of government intervention, arguing that market mechanisms are inherently more efficient in aligning incentives. The policymaker, on the other hand, might emphasize the importance of robust regulatory frameworks and independent oversight bodies to ensure accountability. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. A well-functioning public administration requires a delicate balance between empowering agents with autonomy and holding them accountable for their actions. Finding this balance is a continuous process of refinement and adaptation. It demands a deep understanding of human behavior, a willingness to experiment with different organizational structures, and a commitment to transparency and public engagement. The quest for efficiency and accountability in bureaucracy is not a problem to be solved, but rather a challenge to be constantly addressed. As we prepare to move into our discussion of game theory and strategic interactions, consider this. How might the strategic choices of different government agencies impact the overall effectiveness of public policy? Are there opportunities for collaboration and coordination that are being overlooked due to bureaucratic silos and conflicting incentives? These are the questions that will guide us forward. Principal-agent problems in sales. Salespeople versus company. As we settle into the comfortable rhythm of our economic exploration, let's gently transition from the broader landscape of information asymmetry to a more specific yet pervasive manifestation of it. The principal-agent problem, specifically within the realm of sales. Imagine, if you will, a quiet corner office overlooking a bustling city, a microcosm of the economic forces we seek to understand. Here, the dynamic between the company and its salespeople plays out, a subtle dance of incentives, monitoring, and contracts. The core of the principal-agent problem, as we've hinted before, arises from the inherent divergence of interests. The company, in its capacity as the principal, desires to maximize overall profitability and market share. Its goals are often long-term, encompassing brand reputation, customer loyalty, and sustainable growth. Salespeople, on the other hand, while ideally aligned with these corporate aspirations, are often driven by more immediate and personal motivations: commission, bonuses, and career advancement. This isn't necessarily a negative reflection on salespeople. It is simply a recognition of human nature operating within a specific economic framework. Let's consider the incentives. The most straightforward compensation structure is a commission-based system. This directly links the salesperson's earnings to their sales performance, ostensibly aligning their interests with the company's objective of increasing revenue. However, this seemingly simple arrangement can introduce unintended consequences. A salesperson, driven by the allure of a larger commission, might prioritize closing a deal quickly, even if it means offering deep discounts that erode profit margins, or worse, making promises about product performance that the company cannot deliver. The short-term gain for the salesperson might translate into long-term damage to the company's profitability and reputation. Monitoring, therefore, becomes a crucial element in mitigating the risks inherent in this misalignment. The company must implement systems to track sales activities, monitor customer feedback, and ensure that salespeople are adhering to ethical and legal guidelines. This can involve sales quotas, performance reviews, and even the implementation of sophisticated customer relationship management systems. However, monitoring is not without its costs. It requires investment in technology, management, oversight, and administrative processes. Furthermore, excessive monitoring can be perceived as intrusive and demoralizing, potentially stifling creativity and initiative among the sales force. It becomes a delicate balancing act. Contracts, in their varied forms, represent the formal articulation of the relationship between the principal and the agent. A well-designed sales contract should not only define the terms of compensation, but also specify performance expectations, ethical standards, and the consequences of non-compliance. It's a blueprint, a carefully constructed agreement aimed at aligning incentives and minimizing the potential for opportunistic behavior. However, contracts are rarely perfect. They are often incomplete, unable to anticipate every possible contingency. The classical economist, with his penchant for rational self-interest, would remind us that individuals will always seek to maximize their own utility within the boundaries of the agreement, and perhaps even push against those boundaries when the opportunity arises. The policymaker, observing this dance, must contemplate whether government regulation or professional standards are necessary to protect consumers. Consider, for example, the use of tiered commission structures. These can be designed to incentivize salespeople to sell higher-value products or services, or to focus on acquiring new customers rather than simply maintaining existing accounts. Similarly, bonus programs can be tied to achieving specific strategic goals, such as increasing market share in a particular geographic region or promoting the adoption of a new product line. The effectiveness of these incentives, however, depends on careful design and calibration. An overly aggressive target, or a poorly structured bonus program, can backfire, leading to unethical behavior or simply demotivating the sales team. Ultimately, the principal-agent problem in sales is a complex interplay of incentives, monitoring, and contracts. It's a reflection of the fundamental economic tension between aligning individual self-interest with the collective good. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The optimal approach will depend on the specific industry, the company's culture, and the nature of the products or services being sold. As we prepare to move forward, perhaps we should ponder, what role does the evolving landscape of digital sales and e-commerce play in exacerbating or mitigating these long-standing incentive problems? Chapter 32, Franchising. Aligning incentives between franchisor and franchisee, we've explored the broader landscape of market structures, the rise and fall of monopolies, and the subtle dance of oligopolies. Now, let's narrow our focus, drifting into the more intimate, yet often complex, world of franchising. Think of it as a microcosm of economic relationships, a space where the echoes of larger principles reverberate in very specific, practical ways. Here, we'll examine how franchising attempts to solve a persistent economic puzzle, the principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem, at its heart, arises when one party, the principal, delegates a task or responsibility to another party, the agent. The rub lies in the differing incentives between the two. The principal wants the agent to act in their best interest, maximizing their welfare. The agent, however, might have their own agenda, perhaps prioritizing their own comfort, short-term gains, or a slightly different interpretation of success. It's a subtle misalignment, a slight tilting of the scales, but its consequences can be significant. Consider the classic example of a shareholder and a CEO. The shareholder wants the CEO to maximize shareholder value. The CEO, while likely sharing this goal, might also be motivated by factors like their own salary, company size, or a desire to avoid risks that could jeopardize their position. This divergence creates the principal-agent problem. How can the shareholder ensure that the CEO truly acts in their best interest? Enter franchising. In this model, a franchisor grants a franchisee the right to operate a business using the franchisor's established brand, system, and trademarks. The franchisor desires consistent quality, brand reputation, and ultimately, profitability across all franchise locations. The franchisee, on the other hand, seeks to earn a comfortable living and build a successful business within the framework provided. Again, a subtle dance of potentially conflicting incentives. How does franchising attempt to align these incentives? Through a carefully constructed system of contracts, monitoring, and incentives designed to minimize the agency problem. The franchise agreement, the legal bedrock of the relationship, is the primary tool. This agreement outlines the franchisee's responsibilities, including adherence to operational standards, quality control measures, and marketing strategies. It also specifies the franchisor's obligations, such as providing training, support, and access to the brand's intellectual property. Beyond the contract, monitoring plays a crucial role. Franchisors often employ field representatives who visit franchise locations to assess compliance with standards, offer guidance, and identify areas for improvement. Mystery shoppers, customer feedback mechanisms, and sales data analysis all contribute to a comprehensive monitoring system. Think of it as a gentle, persistent feedback loop, guiding the franchisee towards the desired behavior. Incentives, of course, are paramount. The franchise fee and ongoing royalty payments create a direct financial link between the franchisee's success and the franchisor's bottom line. When the franchisee thrives, the franchisor benefits, creating a powerful alignment of interests. Moreover, many franchise agreements include renewal clauses, providing a strong incentive for franchisees to maintain high standards and operate the business effectively over the long term. The prospect of losing the franchise, their livelihood, is a potent motivator. However, the principal agent problem is never fully eradicated. Information asymmetry, where the franchisee possesses more information about their local market and operational realities than the franchisor, can still lead to suboptimal decisions. Franchisees might be tempted to cut corners on quality, deviate from established marketing strategies, or engage in other behaviors that, while potentially benefiting them in the short term, could harm the brand's overall reputation. This tension requires constant vigilance and adaptation on both sides. The success of a franchise system hinges on the franchisor's ability to design a system that effectively aligns incentives, minimizes monitoring costs, and fosters a sense of shared purpose. It's a delicate balancing act, a constant negotiation between control and autonomy, between standardization and flexibility. Too much control can stifle the franchisee's entrepreneurial spirit. Too little can lead to inconsistency and brand erosion. Franchising, therefore, offers a fascinating case study in how economic principles are applied in the real world. It demonstrates the challenges of delegation, the importance of well-designed contracts, and the power of aligning incentives. It reveals the constant effort required to navigate the complexities of human behavior and the persistent, ever-present undercurrent of the principal-agent problem. But what happens when these carefully constructed relationships encounter the unpredictable forces of macroeconomic shifts? How do external shocks ripple through the intricate network of franchisor-franchisee agreements? We'll turn to these broader economic currents in our next exploration. The gig economy, principal-agent problems in the age of freelancing. We've explored the grand sweep of markets and the subtle dance of supply and demand. Now, let us turn our attention to a more granular, yet increasingly prevalent, economic landscape, the gig economy. This realm of freelancing, short-term contracts, and project-based work throws into sharp relief a fundamental challenge inherent in many economic relationships: the principal-agent problem. The principal-agent problem arises when one party, the principal, delegates authority to another party, the agent, to act on their behalf. It sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But within this delegation lies a potential for misalignment. The principal naturally desires the agent to act in their best interest, to maximize their welfare. However, the agent, being a separate individual with their own motivations, might not always share those exact same interests. They might prioritize their own benefit, even if it comes at the expense of the principal. Think of a company hiring a CEO. The shareholders are the principals, and the CEO is their agent. The shareholders want the CEO to increase the company's value. But the CEO might be more interested in maximizing their own salary, accumulating power, or undertaking projects that boost their ego, regardless of the impact on shareholder value. This discrepancy is the heart of the principal-agent problem. 3 key elements come into play in addressing this inherent tension: incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Let us consider each in turn, watching their interplay create a sense of balance within the economic ecosystem. Incentives are the carrots and sticks designed to align the agent's interests with those of the principal. They aim to make it profitable for the agent to act in the principal's best interest. These can take many forms: performance-based bonuses, stock options, profit sharing, or even the threat of dismissal for poor performance. In the context of the gig economy, incentives could include bonuses for completing projects ahead of schedule, positive ratings that attract future clients, or higher hourly rates for experienced freelancers. However, simply providing incentives is not enough. The principal must also monitor the agent's actions to ensure they are indeed working towards the desired outcome. Monitoring involves gathering information about the agent's behavior and performance. This can be costly and time-consuming, but it is crucial for ensuring accountability. In a traditional employer-employee relationship, monitoring might involve regular performance reviews, tracking key performance indicators, or even direct supervision. In the gig economy, platforms often facilitate monitoring through feedback systems, project milestones, and automated tracking of work hours. And finally, we arrive at contracts. Contracts are the formal agreements that define the terms of the relationship between the principal and the agent. They specify the responsibilities of each party, the compensation to be paid, and the consequences of failing to meet expectations. A well-designed contract can mitigate the principal-agent problem by clearly defining the goals, outlining the metrics for success, and providing mechanisms for resolving disputes. In the gig economy, contracts might outline the scope of work, the payment schedule, and the ownership of intellectual property. The classical economist often advocated for clear and enforceable contracts, believing they were the bedrock of efficient economic interactions. The policymaker, on the other hand, might focus on regulations and oversight to ensure fairness and prevent exploitation, especially in the context of vulnerable gig workers. Consider the rise of ride-sharing platforms. The company wants drivers to provide safe and reliable transportation. The drivers, however, might be tempted to prioritize maximizing their earnings, even if it means cutting corners on safety or neglecting vehicle maintenance. Incentives like surge pricing can encourage drivers to be available during peak demand. Monitoring through GPS tracking and passenger ratings helps ensure accountability. And contracts, often accepted electronically, outline the terms of service and the consequences of violations. Yet, even with these mechanisms in place, the principal-agent problem persists. How do we truly ensure that the incentives are perfectly aligned, that monitoring is effective without being intrusive, and that contracts are fair and equitable for all parties involved? The gig economy, while offering flexibility and opportunity, also presents unique challenges in navigating these complex relationships. As we move forward and witness the further automation and digital transformation of the workforce, how will these relationships be reshaped? What new forms of economic organization will emerge, and what new challenges will they present? Chapter 34: Principal-Agent Problems in International Trade. Governments versus exporters, importers. Last time, we explored the delicate dance of comparative advantage and the gains from trade. Tonight, our gaze shifts inward to the frictions that arise within the very machinery of international exchange. We delve into the fascinating and sometimes frustrating world of principal-agent problems as they manifest between governments and the economic actors they seek to regulate, our exporters and importers. Think of it as examining the subtle vibrations within a finely tuned engine, often unseen, yet profoundly impacting its overall performance. The principal-agent problem, at its heart, is a story of asymmetric information and conflicting incentives. One party, the principal, in our case, the government, delegates authority or tasks to another party, the agent, our exporters and importers. The principal hopes the agent will act in their best interest. However, the agent possesses information the principal does not, and the agent's own interests may diverge from those of the principal. Consider a policymaker crafting trade regulations. Their objective might be multifaceted: promoting domestic industry, ensuring fair competition, or adhering to international agreements. These goals are inherently complex and often require a delicate balancing act. To achieve these objectives, the policymaker relies on the actions of exporters and importers. For instance, to comply with international rules on subsidies, the policymaker needs accurate reporting from exporters regarding any government support they receive. However, an exporter might be tempted to underreport subsidies. After all, declaring them fully could lead to increased scrutiny, potential tariffs from importing countries, or pressure to return the subsidy. This creates an incentive misalignment. The government wants accurate information, but the exporter has a vested interest in concealing the full picture. This information asymmetry is the fertile ground where principal-agent problems take root. The question then becomes, how can the principal ensure that the agent acts in a way that aligns with the principal's objectives? The answer, unsurprisingly, lies in a combination of incentives, monitoring, and contracts, each acting as a form of corrective force, gently guiding the system towards equilibrium. Incentives can take many forms: offering tax breaks for accurate reporting, providing subsidies conditional on transparency, or rewarding firms that adhere to ethical trading practices, are all examples of aligning incentive. Think of it as gently redirecting a stream by making the desired channel more appealing. Monitoring involves the principal expending resources to observe the agent's behavior. This could involve customs inspections to prevent smuggling, audits of export declarations, or investigations into unfair trade practices. Monitoring, however, is costly. It requires resources and can create friction in trade flows. The ideal level of monitoring strikes a balance between deterring undesirable behavior and minimizing the burden on legitimate trade. Contracts, in this context, refer to the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern international trade. These contracts specify the rights and obligations of both parties, and they provide a mechanism for dispute resolution. However, contracts are only effective if they are enforceable. Weak legal institutions or a lack of international cooperation can undermine the effectiveness of trade agreements, leaving the principal vulnerable to opportunistic behavior by the agent. Consider the problem of transfer pricing. Multinational corporations can manipulate the prices at which they trade goods and services between their subsidiaries, shifting profits to countries with lower tax rates. This is perfectly legal in some circumstances, but can also be used to avoid taxes. The government, as the principal, wants to collect its fair share of tax revenue. The multinational corporation, as the agent, has an incentive to minimize its tax burden. Addressing this principal-agent problem requires sophisticated tax laws, international cooperation on tax enforcement, and diligent monitoring of transfer pricing practices. Another example arises in the realm of intellectual property. Governments want to protect the intellectual property rights of their citizens and businesses. However, importers in other countries may be tempted to produce and sell counterfeit goods, violating those rights. The government, as the principal, needs to enforce its intellectual property laws. The importer, as the agent, has an incentive to profit from piracy. This necessitates international agreements, robust enforcement mechanisms, and public awareness campaigns to combat counterfeiting. The challenges posed by principal-agent problems in international trade are multifaceted and constantly evolving. As trade becomes more complex and globalized, these issues will only become more pressing. The effective design of incentives, monitoring mechanisms, and contract enforcement will be crucial to ensuring that the gains from trade are realized fairly and efficiently. Tonight, We've merely scratched the surface of this complex interplay. Next, we'll turn our attention to the role of international institutions in mitigating these principal-agent dilemmas. How can international organizations, like the World Trade Organization, help to align the incentives of governments and businesses and promote a more equitable and transparent global trading system? The question remains, how do we build bridges across the information asymmetry to cultivate trust and shared prosperity? This is our next horizon. Corruption and bribery. The ultimate agency problem. Good evening. Tonight, our contemplation turns to a delicate and frankly unpleasant subject. We speak of corruption, specifically bribery, and its intimate relationship with the principal-agent problem. Think of it as a particularly virulent strain of agency failure, where incentives are not merely misaligned, but deliberately, almost maliciously, inverted. Recall the fundamental dynamic. A principal delegates authority to an agent, entrusting them with decisions that affect the principal's welfare. The ideal scenario is one of perfect alignment. The agent, in pursuing their own self-interest, inadvertently advances the principal's goals. But we rarely inhabit ideal realms, do we? Information asymmetries and divergent motivations often fracture this harmony, creating the fertile ground for agency problems. Now, introduce bribery. It is a corrosive force that warps the landscape of incentives. Consider a procurement officer, our agent, tasked with selecting a vendor for a public works project. The principal, in this case, is the citizenry or the governing body. The officer's duty is to choose the vendor that offers the best value, balancing cost, quality, and reliability. But what happens when a vendor offers a clandestine payment, a bribe, in exchange for preferential treatment? The agent's incentives are now profoundly distorted. The officer's self-interest, amplified by the illicit lure of personal enrichment, clashes directly with the principal's welfare. The vendor chosen may not be the most efficient, the most qualified, or even the most ethical. Public resources are squandered, and the project may be compromised, all because the agent succumbed to the seductive whisper of corruption. Bribery is at its core a breakdown in the contractual relationship. The contract, whether formal or implicit, stipulates that the agent act in the principal's best interest. Bribery violates this fundamental premise, effectively rewriting the contract in the shadows, with the agent and the corrupter as co-authors. It's a form of hidden bargaining that excludes the principal, leaving them to bear the consequences. What makes this particularly insidious is the difficulty of detection. Bribery thrives in secrecy, cloaked in coded language and concealed transactions. Monitoring mechanisms, designed to ensure agent compliance, are often circumvented or even co-opted by the corrupt themselves. The challenge lies in designing robust monitoring systems that can penetrate this veil of secrecy and expose the underlying malfeasance. This might involve independent audits, whistleblower protections, and transparent procurement processes. The classical economist might propose stricter penalties as a deterrent. Higher fines, longer prison sentences, these are certainly tools in the arsenal. But deterrence alone is rarely sufficient. It's like attempting to dam a river with sandbags. Eventually, the pressure will find a way through. We must also address the underlying conditions that foster corruption: weak institutions, lack of transparency, and a culture of impunity. The policymaker, therefore, needs a multifaceted approach. Promoting ethical leadership, strengthening regulatory frameworks, and fostering a culture of accountability are all crucial components. Think of it as creating a balanced ecosystem, where corruption is less likely to take root and flourish. Just as a healthy forest resists disease, a well-governed society is more resistant to the temptations of bribery. Consider, too, the role of information. Access to information is a powerful antidote to corruption. When citizens have the ability to scrutinize government actions, to track public spending, and to hold officials accountable, the opportunities for corruption diminish. Transparency acts as a disinfectant, exposing shady deals to the light of day and deterring potential wrongdoers. Bribery, then, is not merely a legal issue. It is a profound economic problem, a distortion of incentives that undermines the efficiency and fairness of markets. It is the ultimate agency problem, where the agent's self-interest trumps all other considerations, to the detriment of the principal and society as a whole. It leaves us with a profound question. How can we design institutions and incentive structures that make corruption a less attractive, and ultimately, a less viable option? Chapter 36. Behavioral Economics and the Agency Problem. Cognitive biases and irrationality. We have, in previous discussions, explored the elegant framework of rational choice, a model where individuals, like perfectly calibrated instruments, weigh costs and benefits with unwavering precision. But tonight, our journey takes us a step further, a step into the fascinating and often unsettling realm of behavioral economics and how it complicates the age-old agency problem. Recall our earlier exploration of incentives, monitoring, and contracts designed to align the interests of principals and agents. The underlying assumption was, of course, that both parties acted rationally. What happens when rationality itself becomes a variable? Imagine a ship at sea. The captain desires a specific course to reach a profitable port. The crew are tasked with navigating and maintaining the vessel. Traditional economic theory posits that, provided appropriate incentives and monitoring, the crew will diligently follow the captain's orders. However, human nature is rarely so straightforward. Behavioral economics illuminates the cognitive biases and irrationalities that can warp this otherwise smooth trajectory. Consider, for example, the allure of present bias. This is the tendency to place disproportionately high value on immediate gratification, often at the expense of long-term goals. A salesperson, tasked with maximizing long-term customer satisfaction, might instead prioritize short-term sales through aggressive, even misleading, tactics. The immediate commission outweighs the potential damage to the company's reputation, a consequence felt much later. This bias disrupts the delicate balance of incentives, leading to suboptimal outcomes. Another common cognitive distortion is loss aversion. The pain of losing something is often felt more acutely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. A fund manager whose performance is judged by investment returns might become excessively risk-averse after a period of losses. The fear of further losses outweighs the potential benefits of pursuing potentially lucrative, albeit riskier, investments. The result? A stagnant portfolio and unmet expectations. The classical economist might scratch their head, wondering why the manager doesn't simply rationally weigh the probabilities. But loss aversion isn't a rational calculation. It's a deep-seated psychological force. Cognitive framing also plays a significant role. How information is presented, the context in which it is placed, can drastically alter decisions, even when the underlying facts remain the same. The policymaker drafting a contract, or the employer designing an incentive scheme, must be acutely aware of how the framing of options can inadvertently influence agent behavior. A bonus structure, framed as a gain, might be more effective than one framed as the avoidance of a loss, even if the net monetary value is identical. Furthermore, the phenomenon of overconfidence can wreak havoc on agency relationships. An entrepreneur, convinced of their own superior abilities, might underestimate the risks involved in a new venture. This overconfidence can lead to excessive risk-taking and, ultimately, failure. Effective monitoring, then, must not only track objective performance metrics, but also assess the agent's level of self-awareness and realism. Contracts, too, are not immune to the influence of behavioral biases. Bounded rationality, the recognition that our cognitive capacity is limited, implies that contracts can never be perfectly complete. There will always be unforeseen contingencies, situations not explicitly covered in the contractual agreement. In these gray areas, the agent's behavioral predispositions will heavily influence their actions. A sense of fairness, a desire for reciprocity, or conversely, a tendency towards opportunism, will all shape their behavior in ways that a purely rational model cannot predict. Therefore, addressing the agency problem in a world populated by humans requires more than just designing clever incentive schemes. It necessitates a deep understanding of the cognitive biases that can undermine even the most carefully crafted contracts. It requires creating organizational cultures that promote transparency, accountability, and a healthy dose of self-reflection. It requires acknowledging that human behavior is not always predictable, not always rational, but always undeniably human. But if contracts are incomplete and humans imperfect, how can organizations best adapt? What new strategies emerge as we acknowledge the inherent messiness of human decision-making? Perhaps that is a journey for our next exploration. Chapter 37. Nudging and Choice Architecture. Influencing Agent Behavior. Welcome back. Last time, we explored the subtle dance of information asymmetry. Now, let's consider how that dance plays out when one party, the principal, delegates authority to another, the agent. This relationship, so pervasive in economics, forms the core of what we call the principal-agent problem. Tonight, we'll discuss how subtle manipulations of the environment, through nudging and choice architecture, can steer the agent's actions closer to the principal's desires. The principal-agent problem arises because the agent, armed with private information and distinct motivations, may not perfectly align their actions with the principal's goals. Imagine, for instance, an employer hiring an employee. The employer wants the employee to work diligently, maximizing productivity. The employee, however, might prefer to exert less effort, prioritizing leisure or personal tasks. This divergence in interests creates the fundamental challenge. To mitigate this misalignment, the principal employs several tools: incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Consider first, incentives. The classical economist, ever practical, might suggest aligning the agent's compensation with the desired outcome. For instance, a salesperson's salary might be partially based on commission. This directly links their financial gain to the principal's revenue, incentivizing them to sell more. However, designing effective incentives is a delicate art. Too much emphasis on a single metric can lead to unintended consequences. A salesperson might prioritize closing deals at any cost, damaging the company's long-term reputation, or simply game the system. Next, we consider monitoring. The principal can actively observe the agent's behavior, ensuring they are adhering to the desired course. This could involve supervisors overseeing employees, or shareholders scrutinizing management decisions. Monitoring, however, is costly. It requires resources, time, and can create a sense of distrust, potentially demotivating the agent. There is a delicate balance to be struck between oversight and autonomy. Finally, contracts offer a more formal mechanism for aligning interests. A well-designed contract specifies the agent's responsibilities, performance targets, and the corresponding rewards and penalties. Contracts provide a framework for accountability and can reduce ambiguity. However, contracts are inherently incomplete. It's impossible to anticipate every contingency, and drafting comprehensive agreements can be prohibitively expensive. Furthermore, reliance on contracts alone can stifle creativity and initiative. Now, where do nudging and choice architecture fit into this framework? Imagine the policymaker tasked with increasing organ donation rates. A classical approach might involve financial incentives, which are often ethically fraught and politically unpopular. Alternatively, they could redesign the organ donation form. Instead of requiring people to actively opt into donation, they could make it the default option, requiring people to actively opt out. This subtle change, a nudge, leverages the power of inertia. People tend to stick with the default option, even if it doesn't perfectly align with their preferences. It changes the choice architecture. Choice architecture refers to the design of the environment in which decisions are made. It encompasses how choices are presented, organized, and framed. Nudges are specific interventions within that architecture, designed to influence behavior in a predictable way, without restricting freedom of choice. They are not mandates or prohibitions, but rather gentle pushes in a desired direction. Consider a company wanting to encourage employees to save more for retirement. They could automatically enroll employees in a retirement savings plan, with the option to opt out. This leverages the same principle of inertia as organ donation. Or, they could frame the benefits of saving in terms of potential future losses rather than potential gains. Loss aversion, a well-documented behavioral bias, often proves more effective than emphasizing potential rewards. Nudging and choice architecture offer a powerful complement to traditional incentive structures and monitoring mechanisms. They are particularly useful when the principal's goal is to encourage behaviors that are demonstrably beneficial to the agent themselves, but which the agent may not pursue due to inertia, cognitive biases, or lack of information. However, the ethical considerations are paramount. Who decides what constitutes a beneficial behavior? How do we ensure that nudges are transparent and respect individual autonomy? These are critical questions that must be addressed before deploying nudges on a large scale. And so, we see that the principal-agent problem, once addressed through incentives, monitoring, and contracts, now also faces the influence of the nudge. But as we design these systems, how do we balance the need for efficiency with the preservation of individual autonomy? As we drift closer to sleep, consider how trust itself might factor into our analysis of moral hazard. What roles do reputation and social norms play in easing this delicate dance? Sleep well. Chapter 38. The Future of Contracts. Blockchain and Smart Contracts. We've spent considerable time understanding the anatomy of contracts, their historical evolution, and the subtle dances of negotiation. Now, let's gently glide towards the horizon, towards a future where technology reshapes these fundamental building blocks of economic interaction. Our lens will remain focused on the principal-agent problem, that persistent shadow cast by information asymmetry and differing objectives. Think of it as observing a complex ecosystem where the introduction of a new species, blockchain and smart contracts, promises to alter the existing balance. The principal-agent problem, at its core, arises from the separation of ownership and control. The principal, let's say an investor, entrusts an agent, perhaps a company executive, to act on their behalf. But their interests aren't always perfectly aligned. The agent might prioritize short-term gains, personal comfort, or even outright self-dealing at the expense of the principal's long-term value. This misalignment necessitates mechanisms to align incentives, monitor behavior, and, crucially, craft contracts that mitigate these risks. Traditionally, these mechanisms have relied on layers of legal frameworks, auditing processes, and reputation-based incentives. Contracts, in particular, play a pivotal role. They attempt to define the responsibilities of each party, specify performance metrics, and outline consequences for non-compliance. However, even the most meticulously drafted contract can be subject to interpretation, dispute, and enforcement challenges. Think of it as a carefully constructed dam holding back a river. Unforeseen floods of ambiguity or bad faith can still breach its walls. Here enters blockchain, the distributed, immutable ledger. Its transparency and decentralized nature offer a unique solution to some aspects of the principal-agent problem. Imagine a supply chain, for example. Traditionally, a principal relies on an agent to adhere to ethical labor standards. Monitoring this adherence can be costly and imperfect. But with a blockchain-based system, each step in the supply chain, from raw material sourcing to final product delivery, can be recorded and verified by multiple participants. This reduces the information asymmetry, making it harder for the agent to deviate from agreed-upon standards without detection. Now, let's introduce smart contracts. Self-executing contracts, written in code and stored on the blockchain. These contracts automatically enforce the terms agreed upon, eliminating the need for intermediaries and reducing the risk of subjective interpretation. Consider a scenario where a principal hires an agent to renovate their kitchen. The smart contract can be programmed to release payments to the contractor in stages, contingent on the completion of specific milestones verified by independent inspectors, their verifications also recorded on the blockchain. This automation minimizes the opportunity for the agent to shirk responsibilities or demand unwarranted payments. However, the promise of blockchain and smart contracts isn't without its limitations. The garbage in, garbage out principle still applies. If the initial data fed into the blockchain is flawed or biased, the resulting outcomes will be similarly tainted. Furthermore, smart contracts are only as good as the code they are written in. Errors or vulnerabilities in the code can lead to unintended consequences, potentially even exploiting the contract for personal gain. The classical economist reminds us that technology alone cannot solve all human fallibilities. Moreover, not all aspects of the principal-agent problem are amenable to technological solutions. Many relationships rely on trust, collaboration, and nuanced judgment, qualities that are difficult to codify into rigid algorithms. As the policymaker often emphasizes, human discretion remains crucial, especially in complex and rapidly changing environments. Replacing all human interaction with automated code may not always be the most efficient or even desirable outcome. The future likely lies in a hybrid approach, a delicate balance between technological automation and human oversight. Blockchain and smart contracts can provide a powerful foundation for transparency, accountability, and efficiency, particularly in situations where monitoring is difficult and trust is low. But these technologies should be viewed as tools to augment, rather than replace, human judgment and ethical considerations. They represent an evolution in contracting, a shift in the delicate ecosystem of economic interaction, but not a complete overthrow. The river still flows, but its course is being subtly reshaped. What unforeseen consequences might arise as blockchain technology continues to permeate the fabric of contracting? And how will the legal and regulatory landscapes adapt to accommodate this evolving paradigm? This question, like a lingering melody, remains to be explored. Chapter 39. Artificial Intelligence and Monitoring. Automated oversight of agents. We've spent considerable time tracing the contours of economic relationships, the ebb and flow of resources and expectations. Now, let us consider a phenomenon poised to reshape one of the oldest and most persistent challenges in economics: the principal-agent problem. This problem, a quiet hum beneath the surface of countless transactions, arises when one party delegates authority to another whose interests may not perfectly align with those of the principal. Consider, for instance, a shareholder and a CEO, or a homeowner and a contractor. The shareholder wishes for maximized profits. The CEO, while ideally sharing that goal, might also prioritize empire building or a less demanding lifestyle. The homeowner desires a structurally sound renovation. The contractor might be tempted to cut corners to boost short-term gains. This divergence of interest, this potential for asymmetric information and opportunistic behavior, forms the bedrock of the principal-agent problem. The traditional solutions have revolved around incentives, monitoring, and contracts. Incentives, like stock options for the CEO or performance-based bonuses for the contractor, aim to align the agent's self-interest with the principal's objective. Monitoring, through audits, oversight committees, or even simple observation, seeks to detect and deter deviations from the agreed-upon course. And contracts, meticulously detailing obligations and penalties, provide a framework for resolving disputes and enforcing compliance. But these methods, while effective to a degree, are often imperfect and costly. Enter artificial intelligence. AI offers the tantalizing prospect of automating and enhancing both monitoring and incentive design, potentially ushering in an era of more efficient and trustworthy principal-agent relationships. Imagine, for example, AI-powered surveillance systems capable of continuously analyzing a contractor's work, detecting deviations from specifications, and even predicting potential structural weaknesses before they manifest. This isn't merely about replacing human inspectors. It's about creating a system that is always vigilant, always objective, and always capable of processing vast amounts of data to identify subtle patterns and anomalies. In the realm of incentives, AI can personalize and optimize reward structures based on an agent's individual behavior and preferences. No longer are we limited to blunt instruments like annual bonuses. AI can track performance metrics in real time, adjusting incentives dynamically to encourage desired actions and discourage undesirable ones. This granular level of control, this ability to tailor incentives to the specific context and individual, promises to unlock new levels of productivity and alignment. Of course, the application of AI to the principal-agent problem is not without its challenges. The classical economist would remind us of the potential for unintended consequences. Algorithmic bias, for example, could lead to unfair or discriminatory outcomes. The policymaker would caution us about the need for transparency and accountability in AI-driven decision-making. If an AI system flags a contractor for substandard work, how do we ensure that the decision is based on objective criteria and not on some hidden bias embedded in the algorithm? Furthermore, there is the risk of agents attempting to game the system, finding ways to manipulate the AI to achieve desired outcomes, regardless of the underlying performance. The most pressing issue, perhaps, is the inherent difficulty of defining and encoding ethical considerations into AI systems. How do we ensure that AI is used to promote fairness, transparency, and accountability in principal-agent relationships, rather than simply to maximize the principal's short-term profits at the expense of the agent's well-being? This requires a thoughtful and nuanced approach, one that goes beyond simply optimizing for efficiency and incorporates broader societal values. As we navigate this evolving landscape, it becomes clear that AI is not a panacea, but a powerful tool. Its effectiveness depends entirely on how we choose to deploy it. If used wisely, AI can help to bridge the gap between principals and agents, fostering greater trust, collaboration, and mutual benefit. But if used carelessly, it could exacerbate existing inequalities and create new forms of exploitation. The future of the principal-agent relationship, it seems, hinges on our ability to harness the potential of AI while mitigating its risks. But as we automate the oversight, who will oversee the automators? Chapter 40. The ethical dimensions of agency problems, fairness and responsibility. Having explored the mechanics of agency, the interplay of incentives and information asymmetry, we now turn a corner. We move from the purely technical to the deeply human, considering the ethical dimensions woven into the fabric of principal-agent relationships. It's a movement, perhaps, from the blueprint of a machine to a contemplation of its purpose, its impact on the wider world. The core of the agency problem, as we've discussed, lies in the divergence of interests. The principal, desiring a specific outcome, delegates authority to the agent. Yet, the agent, with their own set of motivations, may not perfectly align with the principal's goals. This misalignment isn't simply an economic inefficiency. It's a potential breeding ground for ethical lapses. The question isn't merely can the agent deviate, but should they, and what mechanisms exist to ensure they won't, or at least won't unduly. Consider, for instance, the scenario of a company executive tasked with maximizing shareholder value. The executive might be tempted to engage in short-term strategies, boosting profits temporarily to inflate their bonus, even if it comes at the expense of the company's long-term sustainability. This represents a clear conflict of interest, a breach of the implicit ethical contract underlying the agency relationship. But is it just about the breach? It ripples further, impacting employees, customers, and the broader economy. The short-term gains extracted at the expense of long-term stability create an instability that extends far beyond the direct agent and principal. This leads us to the critical concept of fairness. Fairness in this context is not simply about equal outcomes, but about equitable processes and just rewards. A contract that disproportionately favors the principal, leaving the agent vulnerable and undervalued, is not ethically sound, even if legally permissible. Conversely, a contract that allows the agent to exploit their position, extracting excessive rents at the principal's expense, is equally problematic. The ideal lies in a balanced agreement, one that recognizes the contributions and risks borne by both parties, fostering a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose. Responsibility, too, plays a crucial role. The agent has a responsibility to act in the best interests of the principal, within the bounds of ethical conduct and legal frameworks. This responsibility extends beyond simply fulfilling the explicit terms of the contract. It encompasses a broader sense of stewardship, a commitment to the principal's well-being and the integrity of the relationship. Imagine the classical economist, who sees the principal-agent relationship as a pure contractual exchange, may focus primarily on designing optimal incentive structures. But the policymaker must also consider the regulatory frameworks that promote transparency, accountability, and ethical behavior, fostering a culture of responsibility that transcends purely economic consideration. Monitoring, often touted as a solution to agency problems, also presents ethical challenges. Excessive or intrusive monitoring can erode trust, creating a climate of suspicion and resentment. The agent, feeling constantly scrutinized, may become demotivated and less creative, ultimately undermining the very goals the monitoring system was designed to achieve. Effective monitoring should be proportionate, transparent, and focused on fostering accountability rather than simply detecting wrongdoing. It should be a tool for guiding behavior, not a weapon for punishing transgression. Incentive design, similarly, requires careful consideration of ethical implications. While performance-based pay can be a powerful motivator, it can also lead to unintended consequences if not carefully calibrated. Agents may be tempted to engage in unethical behavior to meet performance targets, such as manipulating data or cutting corners on safety. The most effective incentive systems are those that align the agent's self-interest with the principal's goals, while also reinforcing ethical values and promoting long-term thinking. Think of a clock, with many gears all needing to move in harmony to tell the correct time. A single misaligned gear can throw off the entire mechanism. Ultimately, addressing the ethical dimensions of agency problems requires a holistic approach. It involves not only designing robust contracts and effective monitoring systems, but also fostering a culture of trust, transparency, and ethical leadership. It requires recognizing that agency relationships are not simply economic transactions, but complex social interactions imbued with moral obligations. As we move forward in our exploration, we must ask ourselves, how can we design economic systems that not only promote efficiency, but also uphold the values of fairness, responsibility, and trust? What lies beyond the current incentive structures and monitoring technologies? Chapter 41. Regulation and Enforcement. Government's role in mitigating agency conflicts. The persistent hum of economic activity is often described as a self-regulating system, guided by the invisible hand of the market. Yet this hand, while potent, is not infallible. It can falter, tremble, and even clench shut, particularly when confronted with the inherent tensions of principal-agent relationships. We have previously delved into the potential for agents to deviate from the best interests of their principals. Today, we turn our attention to how government, as a societal arbiter, seeks to correct these deviations and ensure a more equitable economic landscape. The core issue, as we understand, stems from asymmetric information and misaligned incentives. The principal, lacking perfect knowledge of the agent's actions and motivations, struggles to ensure compliance. The agent, meanwhile, may be tempted to prioritize personal gain, even at the expense of the principal's well-being. This inherent conflict is not a moral failing, but rather a predictable consequence of the structure itself. The government's intervention manifests in two primary forms: regulation and enforcement. Regulation involves establishing rules and guidelines that govern the agent's behavior. These rules can be broadly categorized. Some prescribe specific actions. Think of environmental regulations dictating emissions limits for factories. Others focus on disclosure, requiring agents to reveal information that might otherwise remain hidden. Securities regulations demanding transparent financial reporting. Still others aim to shape the very incentives that drive agent behavior, such as tax policies that encourage certain investments. The classical economist, a staunch advocate of free markets, might argue that regulation is a blunt instrument, inevitably distorting market signals and stifling innovation. They would contend that private contracts, coupled with the watchful eye of market competition, are sufficient to discipline agents. And to an extent, they are correct. Competition can incentivize agents to act in the principal's best interest, lest they lose business to a more trustworthy competitor. However, competition is not always perfect. Information asymmetries persist, and some agents may possess market power that allows them to exploit their principals with impunity. This is where enforcement comes into play. Even the most elegantly crafted regulation is rendered meaningless if it lacks teeth. Enforcement involves monitoring agent behavior, detecting violations, and imposing penalties. This can take many forms, from routine inspections to complex legal proceedings. The effectiveness of enforcement hinges on several factors: the clarity of the regulations themselves, the resources allocated to monitoring and investigation, and the severity of the penalties. The policymaker faces a delicate balancing act. Too little regulation and enforcement, and agents are given free rein to exploit their principles, leading to market failures and social harm. Too much, and the economy becomes burdened by red tape, stifling innovation and economic growth. The optimal level of government intervention is not a fixed point, but rather a dynamic equilibrium that shifts with the evolving complexity of the economy. It is a constant adjustment, a careful calibration of the scales. Consider the realm of corporate governance. Shareholders, as the principals, delegate decision-making authority to corporate managers, the agents. Regulations governing insider trading, requiring shareholder votes on major corporate actions, and mandating independent board oversight are all designed to mitigate the inherent agency conflicts. Enforcement, through securities regulators and the courts, ensures that these regulations are respected. However, the system is not without its flaws. Regulations can be complex and costly to implement. Enforcement can be slow and cumbersome. And as we have seen, agents are adept at finding loopholes and exploiting ambiguities. The dance between regulation, enforcement, and agent ingenuity is a perpetual cycle, a never-ending game of cat and mouse. Ultimately, the government's role in mitigating agency conflicts is to create a framework of rules and institutions that encourages agents to act in the best interests of their principals. This framework is not a panacea, but rather a vital component of a well-functioning market economy. It is a safety net, a guardrail, a gentle nudge in the right direction. Case study: Enron and the agency problem of corporate greed. Good evening. We've previously discussed the beautiful, if sometimes chaotic, dance between supply and demand, and how incentives guide economic actors. Tonight, we turn our attention to a particularly poignant example of what happens when those incentives become dangerously misaligned: the Enron scandal. This serves as a stark case study, illustrating the agency problem and how corporate greed, left unchecked, can unravel even the most seemingly stable institutions. The agency problem, at its heart, is a matter of divided interests. Imagine a principal, the shareholder, the owner, entrusting their assets to an agent, the manager, the executive. The principal wants the agent to act in their best interest, to maximize the value of their investment. However, the agent, being human, also has their own interests, perhaps personal enrichment, career advancement, or simply minimizing effort. When these interests diverge, the agency problem arises. Now, let's consider incentives. Incentives are the invisible hand that guides behavior. Properly structured incentives can align the agent's actions with the principal's goals. Stock options, for example, are intended to encourage managers to increase shareholder value because their personal wealth is directly tied to the company's performance. However, as Enron tragically demonstrated, even well-intentioned incentives can be perverted. The executives at Enron were heavily incentivized to increase the company's stock price. This, in itself, wasn't inherently wrong. The problem arose when the pressure to maintain ever-increasing profits led to unethical and ultimately illegal accounting practices. They created shell companies to hide debt, inflated earnings, and painted a rosy picture for investors that was far removed from reality. The stock price soared, the executives profited handsomely, but the underlying foundation of the company was crumbling. Monitoring plays a crucial role in mitigating the agency problem. This involves mechanisms that allow the principal to keep tabs on the agent's actions, to ensure they are acting responsibly and ethically. Boards of directors are supposed to serve this function, acting as a check on management's power. Independent auditors are meant to verify the accuracy of financial statements. Internal control systems are designed to prevent fraud and errors. However, in Enron's case, all these safeguards failed. The board was either complicit or asleep at the wheel. The auditors were swayed by lucrative consulting contracts, and the internal controls were deliberately circumvented. Contracts, the formal agreements outlining the agent's responsibilities and the consequences of failing to meet them, are another key tool. These contracts specify performance targets, define acceptable behavior, and establish penalties for misconduct. However, no contract can cover every possible contingency, and even the most robust contract is only as effective as its enforcement. At Enron, the contracts were often vague, easily manipulated, or simply ignored. The emphasis was on short-term gains, not long-term sustainability. The classical economist, observing this situation, might say that it was a failure of markets, a distortion of the price signal. The policymaker might argue for stricter regulations, more robust oversight, and harsher penalties for corporate wrongdoing. And the moral philosopher might lament the decline of ethical values and the corrosive influence of greed. Enron serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that incentives, monitoring, and contracts are not foolproof solutions to the agency problem. They are tools that must be used wisely, with constant vigilance and a deep understanding of human nature. The case highlights the importance of strong ethical leadership, independent oversight, and a culture of transparency and accountability. It reminds us that unchecked greed can have devastating consequences, not just for shareholders, but for employees, communities, and the entire economy. So, as we drift towards slumber, let us ponder this. If even seemingly sophisticated systems of governance can fail so spectacularly, what new paradigms must we explore to truly align the interests of capital with the well-being of all? Chapter 43, Case Study. The 2008 Financial Crisis and the Agency Problem of Wall Street, having considered the theoretical underpinnings of asymmetric information and moral hazard. We now turn our attention to a significant real-world manifestation of these challenges. The 2008 Financial Crisis. This crisis serves as a powerful case study illustrating the agency problem, particularly as it unfolded on Wall Street. Remember our focus: incentives, monitoring, and contracts. These three pillars, when weakened, can destabilize entire economic systems. Before we delve into the specifics, let us recall the fundamental essence of the principal-agent problem. The principal delegates a task to the agent, expecting the agent to act in the principal's best interest. However, the agent often possesses superior information and may have incentives that diverge from those of the principal. This divergence can lead to suboptimal outcomes, even outright harm, to the principal. In the context of Wall Street, the principals were in essence the investors, those entrusting their capital to financial institutions. The agents were the bankers, traders, and executives responsible for managing and growing that capital. The contracts, in this scenario, were the formal agreements, regulatory frameworks, and implicit expectations that governed the relationship between these parties. One of the key areas where the agency problem manifested was in the securitization of mortgages. Financial institutions bundled mortgages into complex securities called mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. These securities were then sold to investors worldwide. The incentives for the agents, the Wall Street firms, were largely driven by short-term profits and compensation. The more securities they created and sold, the higher their earnings and the larger their bonuses. This created a powerful incentive to increase the volume of mortgages being securitized, regardless of the underlying quality of those mortgages. We begin to see a flow of capital, a river of investment, being diverted from stable channels into less secure terrain. The problem was compounded by weak monitoring. Rating agencies, tasked with assessing the creditworthiness of these complex securities, were often paid by the same firms that created them. This created a conflict of interest, incentivizing the rating agencies to provide overly optimistic ratings, regardless of the actual risk. The safeguards, the monitoring systems, designed to ensure stability, were themselves compromised, akin to a broken dam, unable to contain the rising waters. Furthermore, the contracts, the regulatory frameworks, were inadequate to address the complexity and innovation occurring in the financial markets. Regulators struggled to keep pace with the rapid development of new financial instruments and the increasingly sophisticated strategies employed by Wall Street firms. This regulatory gap allowed firms to exploit loopholes and engage in practices that ultimately undermined the stability of the financial system. The scales of justice, meant to maintain balance, were themselves tilting precariously. The consequences were devastating. As housing prices began to decline, homeowners started defaulting on their mortgages. This triggered a cascade of losses throughout the financial system, as the value of mortgage-backed securities plummeted. Banks, heavily invested in these securities, faced massive losses and became reluctant to lend to each other. The entire financial system teetered on the brink of collapse. The 2008 financial crisis provides a stark lesson in the importance of aligning incentives, strengthening monitoring, and establishing robust contracts. It highlights the dangers of allowing agents to pursue their own interests at the expense of their principals, particularly when those agents operate within a complex and opaque financial system. We observe a system, once seemingly in equilibrium, thrown into disarray by the unchecked pursuit of self-interest. Consider the aftermath. The crisis spurred significant regulatory reforms, such as the Dodd-Frank Act, aimed at increasing transparency, strengthening oversight, and mitigating systemic risk. These reforms sought to address the agency problem by aligning incentives, improving monitoring, and reinforcing contractual obligation. However, the effectiveness of these reforms remains a subject of ongoing debate. As we look ahead, a question lingers. Have we truly learned the lessons of 2008? Are the incentives on Wall Street now sufficiently aligned with the interests of investors in the broader economy? Or are we simply witnessing a temporary lull before the next wave of financial innovation and the inevitable re-emergence of the agency problem? What new forms will moral hazard take in the evolving landscape of finance? This is the question that hangs in the air, a gentle echo of the storm that once passed. Our next exploration will consider the complexities of economic forecasting and whether such storms can ever be predicted with sufficient accuracy. Chapter 44. The global impact of principal-agent problems. A cross-cultural perspective. Previously, we examined the foundational elements of principal-agent relationships, focusing largely on idealized scenarios within a single cohesive market. Now, let us broaden our view, ascending to a higher vantage point to survey the diverse landscape of principal-agent problems across the globe. Tonight, we consider the influence of culture, institutions, and varying levels of economic development on the efficacy of incentives, the nature of monitoring, and the enforcement of contracts in these vital relationships. The core of the principal-agent problem, as we recall, lies in the inherent asymmetry of information. The agent, entrusted with acting on behalf of the principal, possesses knowledge the principal lacks, knowledge about their effort, their intentions, and the true state of the world. This informational disparity creates space for moral hazard and adverse selection, scenarios where the agent may shirk their responsibilities or misrepresent their abilities, all to the potential detriment of the principal. However, the manifestation and magnitude of these problems are far from uniform across cultures. Consider, for instance, the role of social capital. In societies with strong social cohesion, where reputation and long-term relationships are highly valued, the incentive for an agent to act opportunistically might be significantly diminished. The fear of social ostracism, the potential loss of future opportunities, becomes a powerful, albeit informal, monitoring mechanism, surpassing the effectiveness of formal contracts or intrusive supervision. Conversely, in societies where trust is low and legal institutions are weak, the principal-agent problem can be significantly exacerbated. The policymaker in such environments faces a formidable challenge: how to design incentive schemes and monitoring mechanisms that are both effective and culturally sensitive. The classical economist might advocate for a purely market-driven approach, emphasizing clearly defined contracts and rigorous enforcement. Yet, this approach often proves inadequate in contexts where legal systems are corrupt, inefficient, or simply inaccessible to many. The design of contracts, too, requires careful consideration of cultural norms and expectations. What constitutes a fair and reasonable agreement in one culture might be perceived as exploitative or unfair in another. For example, performance-based compensation, a common tool for aligning incentives, might be viewed with suspicion in cultures that prioritize seniority or group harmony. Imposing such a system without understanding the underlying cultural values can lead to resentment, reduced productivity, and even outright resistance. Moreover, the effectiveness of monitoring mechanisms varies significantly across cultural contexts. In some societies, direct supervision is accepted and even expected, while in others, it is perceived as intrusive and disrespectful, potentially undermining the agent's autonomy and motivation. The policymaker must therefore consider alternative forms of monitoring, such as peer review, self-reporting, or the use of indirect indicators of performance. The level of economic development, also plays a crucial role. In developing countries, principal agent problems are often more pronounced due to weaker institutions, limited access to information, and a greater reliance on informal relationships. The agent, often facing economic hardship and limited opportunities, might be more tempted to engage in opportunistic behavior. The principal, in turn, may lack the resources and expertise to effectively monitor the agent or enforce contracts. Furthermore, the globalization of markets has introduced new complexities to the principal-agent relationship. Multinational corporations, operating across diverse cultural and institutional environments, face the challenge of managing agents who may hold vastly different values, beliefs, and expectations. Standardized incentive schemes and monitoring practices designed for a homogeneous workforce are often ineffective in these heterogeneous settings. The modern corporation must adapt, becoming a chameleon in the economic landscape, adapting its policies and practices to fit the unique cultural context of each operating environment. Ultimately, the global impact of principal-agent problems highlights the importance of context-specific solutions. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to designing incentives, monitoring agents, or enforcing contracts. The effective policymaker must possess a deep understanding of the cultural, institutional, and economic factors that shape human behavior in each specific context. As we prepare to turn the page, one question lingers: how will technological advancements, particularly in the realm of decentralized autonomous organizations, further reshape the dynamics of principal-agent relationships in the future, and what new ethical considerations will arise as a consequence? Chapter 45. Conclusion. Towards more efficient and equitable agency relationships, we have navigated the intricate landscape of principal-agent problems, tracing its valleys of asymmetric information and scaling its peaks of contractual design. The journey, while perhaps winding, has hopefully illuminated the fundamental tension at the heart of so many economic interactions: the misalignment of incentives between those who delegate authority and those who exercise it. Now, as the dusk settles on our exploration, let us consider the path forward, a path leading towards more efficient and equitable agency relationships. The core challenge, as we've established, stems from the principal's imperfect knowledge. The agent, possessing superior information about their own actions and the environment in which they operate, can exploit this informational advantage to pursue their own self-interest, often to the detriment of the principal. The classical economist, peering from a long-ago era, might have suggested that unfettered markets would naturally correct these imbalances. That competition, like a cleansing fire, would burn away inefficiencies and incentivize agents to act in the principal's best interest. However, as our analysis has shown, reality is rarely so straightforward. Market imperfections, informational asymmetries, and the inherent complexity of human behavior often conspire to frustrate this idealized outcome. Thus, the burden falls upon the policymaker, and indeed all participants in economic life, to design mechanisms that mitigate the adverse effects of principal-agent problems. These mechanisms, as we've discussed, can take many forms. Stronger monitoring systems, facilitated by technological advancements and sophisticated data analysis, offer the potential to reduce informational gaps. Imagine a flow of information, once a trickle, now a steady stream, allowing the principal to observe the agent's actions with greater clarity. However, monitoring is not without its costs. Excessive oversight can stifle innovation, erode trust, and create a bureaucratic quagmire. The goal, then, is to find the optimal balance, the point at which the benefits of increased monitoring outweigh the associated costs. Contractual design remains a crucial tool in aligning incentives. Performance-based compensation, stock options, and other forms of contingent payment can incentivize agents to act in ways that benefit the principal. Yet, even the most meticulously crafted contract is unlikely to be perfect. Unforeseen circumstances, loopholes, and the inherent limitations of language can all undermine the intended alignment. Furthermore, focusing solely on quantifiable metrics can lead to unintended consequences, encouraging agents to prioritize easily measured outcomes at the expense of less tangible but equally important considerations. Think of the river. carefully channeled to provide irrigation, but also robbed of its natural meanders and ecological diversity. Beyond monitoring and contracts, a third, perhaps less tangible, element plays a vital role: the cultivation of trust and shared values. When principals and agents share a common understanding of goals and ethical principles, the need for extensive monitoring and complex contracts diminishes. A sense of shared purpose can foster intrinsic motivation, encouraging agents to act in the principal's best interest, even in the absence of explicit incentives. This, of course, is easier said than done. Building trust requires transparency, open communication, and a commitment to fairness on both sides. It is a delicate ecosystem, easily disrupted by betrayal or perceived injustice. The path towards more efficient and equitable agency relationships is therefore not a simple linear progression, but rather a complex, iterative process of experimentation and adaptation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The optimal approach will depend on the specific context, the nature of the relationship, and the prevailing institutional environment. Consider the carefully balanced scales, constantly adjusting to maintain equilibrium, reflecting the ever-shifting weights of incentives, monitoring, and trust. As we conclude this phase of our inquiry, let us acknowledge that the principal-agent problem is not a static phenomenon. It evolves in response to technological advancements, changing social norms, and the ever-shifting landscape of the global economy. New forms of agency relationships are constantly emerging, driven by the rise of the gig economy, the increasing prevalence of remote work, and the growing importance of digital platforms. These new contexts present both challenges and opportunities. They demand fresh thinking, innovative solutions, and a continued commitment to understanding the fundamental dynamics of incentives, monitoring, and contracts. But what new paradoxes will these evolving landscapes bring? Will the rise of decentralized autonomous organizations render the traditional principal-agent framework obsolete, or will it simply give rise to new, even more complex, forms of agency problems? These questions and others beckon us towards the next chapter in our economic exploration.